Connect, bringing to the community innovation in transportation planning, commuter services, clean fuels, and intelligent transportation systems. More at northfloridatpo.com.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Ahead in the next 5 minutes, live local news for the First Coast from the WJCT News team.
School boards across Florida stand up to the governor. Is the law on their side? I'm Melissa Ross, and just ahead this hour on First Coast Connect, we speak with Jacksonville government law attorney Chris Hand about the power of local school boards to regulate the public health of their students. That's coming up. Then later.
Some people are wearing masks, which is an improvement, because before Chief Judge Mahan did that, basically no one was wearing a mask. There's still a lot of people who aren't wearing masks, and some of them are actually judges.
Local attorneys say a new mask order for North Florida courts isn't being followed. Plus some good news for your Wednesday. That and more, all ahead. After the day's news.
Live from NPR News, I'm Janine Herbst. Consumer prices rose last month, though they were down slightly from June. The Labor Department says prices are up 5.4% from a year ago this time, matching a 13-year high. As NPR's David Gura reports, economists are concerned about how long inflation is going to last.
The Labor Department's Consumer Price Index rose 0.5% from June to July, which is faster than normal, but in line with what economists expected. And so a trend continues. Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, has said price increases are a consequence of the economy reopening. Problems with supply chains have been an issue. Still, the fear is inflation will become persistent, which could complicate the Fed's plan for scaling back a bond buying program it put in place during the pandemic and its timetable for raising interest rates, which it continues to keep near zero. David Gura, NPR News.
The Senate has voted to approve a $3.5 trillion budget resolution put forth by Democrats. NPR's Windsor Johnston reports the move sets the stage for the party to craft sweeping legislation that would advance many of the items on President Biden's economic agenda.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer says the budget blueprint is the largest expansion of the federal safety net in decades.
Democratic budget will bring a generational transformation to how our economy works for average Americans. And it will be paid for by making our tax code more progressive and more fair, asking corporations and the wealthy pay their fair share.
The budget resolution, which has no support from Senate Republicans, includes new spending for child care, education, and measures to curb climate change. The larger spending plan, as well as a smaller bipartisan infrastructure package passed by the Senate on Tuesday, now head to the House. Windsor Johnston, NPR News, Washington.
Insurgents now control two-thirds of Afghanistan as U.S. and NATO troops continue their withdrawal. Taliban fighters have seized 3 more provincial capitals and a local army headquarters in the northeast of the country. NPR's Lauren Freire reports India is evacuating its citizens from Afghanistan.
India sent a military plane to fly its citizens home from Afghanistan. It's closed the last of its consulates there. Only the embassy in Kabul remains open. Some opposition politicians are also urging the Indian government to help evacuate Afghanistan's religious minorities, Hindus and Sikhs, to save them from Taliban attacks.
NPR's Lauren Freire reporting. President Biden says he plans to host a virtual summit for democracy in December as he aims to assemble government, civil society, and private sector leaders in what he's cast as a global face-off against rising autocratic forces. The White House says the summit would galvanize commitments and initiatives including defending against authoritarianism, fighting corruption, and promoting respect for human rights. You're listening to NPR News.
It's now 4 minutes after 9. This is WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. Good morning. I'm Michelle Corum. More than 100 concerned citizens spoke at a school board meeting in St. Johns County yesterday. It was the last scheduled meeting before the school year begins next week. WJCT News' Sydney Bowles reports after hearing opposing views, the board decided to keep masks optional in line with state rules.
Parents worried about COVID-19 spreading in schools called on the St. Johns County School District to implement stricter rules for face masks. Superintendent Tom Forson says he strongly encourages mask use, but the school board attorney Frank Upchurch says the executive order from Tallahassee is clear.
I think if we were to defy this mandate, it wouldn't surprise me if the district were sued by an anti-masker.
Board Chair Patrick Kanan says the situation is fluid and the board may revisit its mask rules. When classes begin next Monday, the desk shields from last year will be gone. Desks will be spread 3 feet apart, and classrooms and other high-touch areas will be cleaned more frequently. Sydney Bowles, WJCT News, 89.9.
The Early Learning Coalition of North Florida is looking for volunteers to read to children in local preschools. There's a need especially right now in Clay County. They're called Reading Pals. If you'd like details about upcoming training sessions, go look for this story at wjct.org. Right now, 81 degrees in Jacksonville. We'll get to almost 90 today.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include iDrive with Remote PC, providing remote access to PCs, Macs, and servers from anywhere, assisting those working from home, and also enabling remote assistance for customers at remotepc.com.
School boards across Florida are standing up to Governor DeSantis. Are they on solid legal ground? Good morning. We're live from Studio 5. I'm Melissa Ross, and this is First Coast Connect. Thanks for listening. Just ahead, we'll tell you what the law says about the power of local school boards to look after the health of their students in this fight over mask mandates. Give us a call, 549-2937. Then later, why local lawyers say a mask order for the courtrooms around town and the region isn't being followed, even by the judges. But first this morning, despite the governor's ban and his threats, school boards across Florida are voting to require masks for students as classes resume around the state this week. The governor and his commissioner of education, Richard Corcoran, are threatening to withhold the paychecks of education officials who defy them on this. Now, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the American Academy of Pediatrics recommend that all K-12 through 12 students wear masks for in-person learning right now, especially here in North Florida, where the Delta variant of coronavirus is filling up local ICUs. Just yesterday, Mayor Lenny Curry announced several new testing sites around town for COVID-19 to meet the incredible demand.
There could be another variant when we get through this. We're just going to have to adapt and work together as a community.
So we are in a public health crisis right now. And when it comes to this issue in our schools, we decided to find out what the Florida Constitution actually says about the power of local school boards to make these decisions. Here are some answers for you. We're pleased to welcome Jacksonville attorney Chris Hand. He specializes in government law. He is the co-author of the book America, the Owner's Manual, with former Florida Governor and Senator Bob Graham. And Chris is also the former chief of staff for the city of Jacksonville. Chris Hand, always good to get your legal insights. Good morning.
Good morning, Melissa. Great to be with you as always.
Give us a call, already getting your calls, as we talk about what the Florida Constitution says about the power of local school boards. And we're talking, too, about local control and home rule. Let us know your thoughts about all this. 549-2937. Emails to firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. Tweets to @MelissaInjax. So, Chris, the governor has threatened to withhold the paychecks of school board officials and superintendents who defy him and mandate masks for students. 7 or 8 districts, by my last count, are going ahead and doing this, although they are, in some cases, offering an opt-out for parents. Is the governor within his rights by threatening to withhold pay to education officials who defy his emergency order?
Melissa, in a word, no. One of the many challenges with the executive order and the resulting rule is incompatibility with the Florida Constitution. As most people know, the Florida Constitution is our ultimate governing document here in the state of Florida. Any state action has to be consistent with the Florida Constitution. And as other attorneys like education law expert Ron Meyer have pointed out, the Florida Constitution couldn't be more clear. Let's just kind of go to the text a little bit here. Article 9 is the part of the Florida Constitution that governs the issue of education. In Section 1, the Constitution mandates, not a suggestion, it's a mandate. It uses that word shall that we're familiar with here in Jacksonville, mandates a safe system of free public schools. And then, again, another mandate in Section 4, the Constitution says that school boards shall operate, control, and supervise all free public schools within their districts. You add those together, and it is local school boards that have authority to make decisions on issues like mask mandates to protect the health of their students and teachers, school staff, and of course others in the school system, not the governor.
There are already a couple of lawsuits filed around this, one at the state level, one at the federal level on behalf of Florida parents. There is a hearing Friday, I believe, in Leon County that is calling for injunctive relief on this. We'll follow that. But Chris, let's say the governor follows through and actually withholds the paychecks of some of these officials. What then?
Well, Melissa, as you may have seen, there's already been some. This issue has, as it's continued to evolve, there have been initial statements, and then there has been some evolution to the state government's position. For example, initially it was indicated there would be an outright ban on mask mandates. Then that became sort of Hope scholarships and allowing mask mandates as long as there was an opt-out. So one of the other areas where kind of the state government position on this has evolved, it was talked about that, the state would stop paying superintendents and school board members. Well, in the letter that Education Commissioner Richard Corcoran has sent to several school districts, including Broward County, Alachua County, and Leon County, all of which have adopted mask mandates, what he said was not that they would withhold salaries anymore, but that they might withhold the equivalent of salaries from funding. So just to give people a sense of what that means numerically, when it was originally sort of out there that they might withhold all state funding here in Jacksonville, I believe that the superintendent here in Duval County indicated that could be somewhere around $600 million if all state funding and grant funding were to be withheld. If you add up the salary of the superintendent and school board members, probably closer to about $600,000. So still a significant amount of money, but very different from what we were originally talking about. So again, it's just part of that continued evolution of what the state government's position is on these issues.
549-2937. What about the argument that it's too little too late for school boards to stand up like this in the defense of local decision making and home rule? People tweeting the show say that local control of school systems has already been eroded, if not completely eliminated, when it comes to how charter schools are funded and supervised in this state, that it has reduced school boards to a largely ceremonial role. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, my thoughts are that that's a decision that ultimately will be made in the court system. As you indicated, there are already lawsuits that parents in the state have filed. There's one in state court in Leon County. There's one in the U.S. District Court for Southern Florida. You had attorneys from both of those legal teams on the show yesterday. So I don't think it's too little too late at all. I suspect that these decisions are going to ultimately be decided. But Melissa, it's important to remember, both the governor and school board members in this state take the exact same oath of office. And one of the primary parts of that oath of office, which can be found in Article 2 of the state constitution, is a pledge to support and defend the Florida Constitution. That is one of the most fundamental aspects of any public official's duty. And as I indicated before, the Constitution could not be more clear about who has the authority to make decisions on these types of issues. So those issues, I think, are going to get resolved in some of the litigation that's filed, either or both in state and federal court. And I strongly suspect that the result could be a reinforcement of the local authority to make these kinds of decisions.
And this is happening, by the way, across the state. Broward County in South Florida. Last night, there was an intense school board meeting in Leon County in Tallahassee. Thousands of people watched it on Facebook Live, Chris. In the end, the superintendent there backed down just a little bit, saying that he will give parents in Leon County schools an opt-out provision, but that they would continue to consult with attorneys to see how they can fight the state on this matter. And so it's been remarkable to see local officials flexing in this way and standing up to what critics say is partisan bullying and an unconstitutional overreach of executive authority.
Well, I think that's probably for a couple of reasons, Melissa. One, that oath of office I talked about and their clear constitutional authority on this. But the authority that one has in office becomes a lot less theoretical and a lot more real when you're talking about issues like the health of kids, particularly kids under 12 that can't be vaccinated. So I suspect that's why you're seeing these positions that different school boards around the state are taking right now. They have the ability under the law, as we've talked about under the Florida Constitution, to operate, control, and supervise public schools. And the way in which they do that could very well make the difference in whether kids get sick. And God forbid, even if kids go beyond getting sick and die as a result of COVID. We saw a very tragic case of that here in Jacksonville just last week. So I know that school board members across the state understand the gravity of this issue. This isn't just a constitutional issue. It's an issue of life and death. And I think that's why you're seeing some of the reactions that you are from school boards. They want to be able to do their jobs. They want to be able to fulfill their oaths of office, not just to support and defend the Florida Constitution, but also to support and defend children, teachers, school staff who could be at risk from this deadly pandemic.
549-2937. As we speak with government law attorney Chris Hand, let me plug his book, America, the Owner's Manual, which he co-wrote with former Florida Governor, former Senator Bob Graham. I recommend this for anyone who wants to better understand our system of government and how you can be a better citizen. Okay, 549-2937. David in Middleburg. Hi, David. How are you?
Good morning, Melissa. How you doing?
Okay.
Yeah, for a party that claims to be so pro-life, the Republican Party, isn't this a step backwards when you don't want to vaccinate, especially when you got children involved? It's another whole game now. Now the children can't speak for themselves, and now they become a pawn in a political game, which nobody wins.
Thanks,
I'll
David.
Take your answer off the air.
Thank you. You know, Chris Hand, let me ask you about this. You've worked in local government. You worked on Capitol Hill in Washington. Now, let's be clear. You've mainly worked for Democrats. But as we've typically understood the differences between the two major parties, we tend to have always have thought about Republicans as really valuing home rule, local control, resisting top-down mandates, devolving government down to the local level as much as possible with the idea that local officials know what's best for their local communities. And so it's really been remarkable to see the governor completely throwing that value, that sort of smaller government, more conservative value out the window with this whole thing.
Well, and Melissa, it's a value that's embedded and enshrined in the Florida Constitution. I mean, in addition to, Article 9, which I talked about, which gives authority to local school boards, of course, Article 8 provides authority to counties and cities, both county and municipal governments, to exercise their powers, what you just referred to in terms of home rule. So it's not just a function of what one political party believes or the other. This is a set of values that's embedded in the Florida Constitution, which is why I suspect you're seeing frustration from school board members, whether they are Democrats or Republicans, from around the state. constitutionally, this is their job to operate, control, or supervise public schools. This is squarely within their decision-making authority, what school board policies are going to be as it relates to masking or other COVID protocols. And so I imagine it's not just been on this issue, of course, we've seen in recent years, whether it's this issue or a variety of others, there has become a bit of a Tallahassee knows best attitude on a variety of issues. And, we're seeing it most recently on this issue related to masks. But again, this is just going to be the latest issue of the relationship between state government authority and local government authority, or state government authority and citizen authority, that's going to be litigated. There's been recent lawsuits on some other issues related to this. The issue of masking is just the latest of efforts to resolve this dispute, which should be resolved by virtue of what's in the Constitution, but clearly it is not yet.
Kendra in Mandarin. Kendra, hi, you're a teacher?
Yes, I am.
Okay, go ahead, Kendra.
Well, what I'd like to say is that in the state of Florida, the law holds that Florida teachers are held to a higher standard of moral and or ethical conduct in and outside of the classroom. So if, for example, a teacher is arrested with a DUI charge or drunken disorderly charge or possession of marijuana, not only can they be disciplined at their school, but they could actually lose their license and certification to teach in Florida. And so the flip side of that is if we're going to be held accountable to a higher standard than all other citizens in ethics and morality, would people agree that then it is incumbent upon us to responsibly make decisions to protect our students and keep them healthy?
Thanks for that, Kendra. Assuming by that you'd prefer to every child in your classroom be masked. I'm taking from your comments. Okay, thank you for that, Kendra. Be safe. Chris Hand.
Well, first of all, Kendra, thank you for your service as a teacher. My mother was a teacher for almost 40 years, including many of those in the Duval County Public School System. So, and I was a student of teachers in the Duval County Public School System. So really appreciate your service. I think you raise a really good point, and it's a point that also goes to the justification for the governor's executive order and for the rules that resulted from it. The justification was not rooted in the Constitution anywhere, even though that is the ultimate governing authority in Florida. It was rooted in something called the Parents' Bill of Rights, which the legislature passed in this past session. And the provision of the Parents' Bill of Rights that the executive order relied upon was the idea that parents have the right to make healthcare decisions for their own children, which I think we all agree with. But of course, one of the most important principles of American democracy is the idea that we cannot assert our individual rights in ways that infringe or interfere with the rights of others. And if a child comes to school without a mask and spreads COVID, then other parents have been denied the right to make healthcare decisions for their children. For that matter, to your point, teachers have been denied the right to make healthcare decisions for themselves. So I think for a variety of reasons, including that one, the justification for this executive order and the resulting rules also is legally ineffective.
Tom on the west side. Go ahead, Tom.
Good morning. Yes, I'm just wondering where the city, the school board, and even the governor's office stands with regard to liability if a child should be either seriously injured through COVID or actually die.
Thanks for that question. There are already lawsuits moving on this type of problem, Chris, and more to be expected?
I think no question. And look, we certainly hope that the type of lawsuit that Tom references will never be necessary, because we all hope that no child gets sick and no child dies as a result of COVID. But of course, we have to rely on the advice of medical experts, many of whom you've had on the show, Melissa. We're hearing from them across the community and across the country that, without masking and without vaccinations for kids under a certain age, it is very possible there could be kids who are hurt by COVID. So we have to anticipate that those types of lawsuits are coming. There is a principle called sovereign immunity that governs to what extent local governments and state government can be liable in the event of personal injuries as a result of government action or government negligence. But I think, unfortunately, given what the medical experts are telling us, we can probably expect those types of lawsuits to follow the ones that have already been filed.
Mike in St. John's. Hi, Mike. How are you? Go ahead.
Good morning. I have a question and then actually two questions. So what happens if the parents don't want the child to get vaccinated and the child wants to get vaccinated? That's number one. Can they get the vaccine without their parents' permission? Mm-hmm. And what about divorcees? Okay, children that have, two different households and a mother here and a father there. One of them wants their child to get vaccinated, the other one doesn't. What kind of dilemma does that cause?
Mike, there are so many legal issues like this that have been born out of this whole problem. Let's begin with the issue of teens. Of course, the reason parents are so concerned about this whole thing right now, Chris, is that children under 12 can't get vaccinated. Those 12 and older can, and the issue of parental consent, I believe, varies by state. Is that right?
That's correct, and this is not, that in particular, that sort of area of health law is not my particular expertise. But in most cases, obviously, parental consent is required for a child to have any kind of health procedure. People who are healthcare lawyers may have a better sense of when that consent can be overcome, but it is a basic principle in the state that if you're under the age of 18 and you want a health procedure, typically that requires parental consent. Again, we'll defer to healthcare lawyers on what exceptions to that might be. Dan also asked about sort of the family law implications. I'm not a family law attorney, but oftentimes those types of decisions are decided in the divorce decree. Whether which parent has the authority to make those types of decisions as well. I think what the question really points out is just how understandably confused and scared parents across the state are right now by this situation. Melissa, I've talked to some parents over the last several days who don't know where to turn, who are very concerned about where this is going to go. There's not good information out there. The law on this, to some extent, is still in flux. So it's not just, it's an unfortunate situation for everybody. Unfortunate for kids, unfortunate for teachers, of course, unfortunate for healthcare workers who are just overwhelmed by the dire situation in hospitals and other healthcare facilities right now. And of course, very unfortunate for parents who are having to grapple with exactly these kinds of questions that the caller just asked without a lot of good guidance right now.
That's right. We've heard from so many parents as well here at WJCT. Lots of emails and tweets as we speak with attorney Chris Hand. Here's one from Paul in St. Johns County. DeSantis doesn't want to have to enforce this order. He just wanted the headline. If it gets overturned, he will just fundraise and campaign on it. Rob emails the show. The legal wrangling by DeSantis to force his will on the citizens of Florida is all for partisan politics, and it will lose in the courts. My understanding is the loser in these lawsuits will foot the bill for the verdict. It will be millions for his lawsuit against Google alone. That's a separate issue about social media and deplatforming. Will the Florida taxpayers be held fiscally responsible for these errant overreaches? Rob, the answer is yes. The taxpayers will be paying for the court costs for all of these matters by the governor that are being challenged on an array of issues. Recent reporting found that attorneys for the state on all of these lawsuits are being paid over $600 an hour. So yes, taxpayers will be on the hook for millions on this and other matters. And, there are so many tweets, I can't get to them all, Chris, but in the main, people are asking constitutional questions. So I'm glad that you are on the show to explain all of this to our listeners. Let me get to a few more calls. Daryl in St. Augustine. Daryl, go ahead.
Good morning. If DeSantis wants to deduct the salary and the amount is $600,000. Could you, this attorney or one other attorney, please start a GoFundMe site? I got money to put in it. I'd like to raise $1 million to give these people that stood up to this, stood up for this issue, a bonus for standing up to big government.
Daryl, thank you for that. You know, it's my understanding, Chris Hand, that Democrats in the Florida Senate say they will begin a GoFundMe for Florida school officials if the governor follows through and the Education Commissioner, Richard Corcoran, follow through on their threat to withhold the paychecks of these people. So
that's correct, Melissa. I think it was sort of indicated yesterday that that Senate Democratic leader Lauren Book and Senator Jason Pizzo, Bobby Powell, and some others are talking about setting up sort of a crowdfunding type account like you're referring to in the event there's deduction. But there's also potentially help coming from Washington. The White House press secretary said yesterday in her briefing that the Biden administration has directed the U.S. Department of Education to look into ways that they might be able to help, with funding to local school districts that lose money as a result of the governor's executive order and other enforcement efforts. So there's a variety of efforts out there, whether it's crowdfunding, whether it's help from federal government. And by the way, that's why you're seeing kind of lawsuits filed in federal court as well. The federal government has a very significant role to play in education. They already are involved in federal government funding. If anyone wants to see some good information about how schools are actually funded between local, state, and federal government, encourage you to follow Gary Fineout from Politico on Twitter, as he had a pretty long thread yesterday about how education funding works in Florida. But there are a variety of different groups trying to work together and help school systems potentially fill the gap if any money is withheld as a result of state action on mask mandate.
Last night on Twitter, Jimmy Petronas, Florida's chief financial officer, tweeted this out. Giving money straight to a public official by using GoFundMe to affect an outcome sounds a lot like bribery, he said. Chris.
Well, and I also noticed that some other public officials responded very quickly and explained why a variety of provisions of the law to kind of help rebut the chief financial officer's, supposition on that provision. But, I think what we're, again, pointing out here is the really difficult position that school boards find themselves in. While it appears that the state is looking to withhold a lot less funding than was originally envisioned, school board members obviously have other concerns as well. For people who watch or listened to the Leon County meeting last night, there was clearly some concern that the governor might exercise his authority to remove county officials from office. In Article 4, Section 7 of the Florida Constitution, it provides the governor with some power to remove local officials from office. Now, I would argue that none of these particular provisions involve that, they invoke such things as malfeasance or misfeasance or neglect of duty, inability to perform official duties. I would argue that none of those apply. In fact, school board members around the state who are passing mask mandates and trying to keep kids and teachers safe from COVID are fulfilling the most important parts of their duties in office, primarily to support and defend the Florida Constitution, which includes those provisions that give school boards the exclusive authority to operate, control, and supervise public schools.
We'll continue to follow it. In the meantime, always great to get your insights. Chris Hand, government law attorney, co-author of America, the Owner's Manual, with former Governor and Senator Bob Graham co-writing that with him, and some other expertise he shares. It's always good to get your insights, Chris. Thanks.
Thank you, Melissa.
And much more still ahead. Later in the hour, why the Cooking Channel thinks one local chef's food is fried and true. That's coming up, but up next.
Some people are wearing masks, which is an improvement because before Chief Judge Mahan did that, basically no one was wearing a mask. There's still a lot of people who aren't wearing masks, and some of them are actually judges.
There's a new mask order back in effect in local courts, but Lawyers say it's being ignored, even by the judges. That's next. Well, of course, mask mandates are a hot topic again, whether they are for school, work, or a local courtroom. Our North Florida Judicial Circuit has brought back a mask mandate for courts in this three-county region on the order of Chief Judge Mark Mahan. But local attorneys say the mask mandate isn't really being followed, even by some of the judges. For more, I spoke with Jacksonville criminal defense attorney Janet Johnson. Janet Johnson, good to be with you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Melissa.
So you're in courtrooms all the time as a local defense attorney. The Chief Judge, Mark Mahan, has reinstituted a mask mandate for this circuit, all the courtrooms around North Florida. What are you observing?
You know, some people are wearing masks, which is an improvement, because before Chief Judge Mahan did that, basically no one was wearing a mask. But there's still a lot of people who aren't wearing masks, and some of them are actually judges, which is kind of alarming and puts you in an awkward position because you really can't say to the judge, I want you to wear a mask. So, you know, they're going through a little process when you go into the courthouse door where they ask you, do you have COVID? Have you had symptoms of COVID? They don't ask if you're vaccinated, interestingly, and then they make sure that you have a mask, but then you see people kind of either taking them off or wearing them around their chins, and a lot of those people are courtroom personnel, people who work at the courthouse.
Mm. And you've brought this to the Chief Judge's attention, right?
Yeah, I did. You know, a lot of us are kind of apoplectic. There's some judges that are doing Zoom, and they're kind of doing it on their own. Most judges are not letting you do Zoom, although maybe that's going to change. You know, and the Chief Judge is in an untenable position. I understand it's difficult. You know, he suggested that you bring it to the attention of the presiding judge. Sometimes the presiding judge is a person not wearing a mask, so obviously that's kind of a no-go. I don't know how you do that.
You're not in a. There's a real power dynamic. Yeah. I mean, you can't afford to upset the judge that you're arguing in front of.
Yeah, and you're just, you know, as an attorney, you're kind of, you know, conditioned to respect the judge and not question the judge unless it's, you know, a ruling or in a setting of an argument. So, yeah, it's an awkward position. They're some distance from you. You know, they're up on the bench, but, you know, we know the Delta variant is different and highly contagious. Even if you are vaccinated, you're at risk. And there are judges who have gotten COVID. So there isn't, you know, it's not that there are people who can get it and can't get it. I don't know the vaccination status of judges. I mean, there's so many unknown things. And then you compare the, you know, family law attorneys are apparently still conducting their hearings and business on Zoom. So, you know, we're in a position where we're kind of, it's like being a frontline worker, I guess. And that's the risk that everyone's going through right now. But, you know, Zoom is working, and now we're not doing it when things seem to be really going badly in our community.
Right. I mean, defense attorneys and prosecutors have to go to court. There is rampant COVID in the local jail, and some of those suspects and inmates are making court appearances. So there's a back and forth between incarcerated people and the court system. Is that driving part of your concern?
Yeah, I mean, there's that. They do have a quarantine list, and they have people they supposedly don't bring over who are on that list, although I've seen that, you know, not be followed. You know, when people get out of jail, they are summoned to go to court within a few days, so it's not as if there's a universe of people who are only in jail, because everyone who gets arrested gets processed through the jail, gets out, and, you know, could have COVID. And then, you know, a lot of defense attorneys are getting sick. I mean, pretty much every day in court you hear about another lawyer who is out and very ill and has tested positive, and someone from his firm or her firm is covering, and you know that they were just working with that person. I mean, it's just, you know, we're at a tipping point, and I think we're going over the edge a little bit, and it's all avoidable. And I think that's the frustration, because Zoom was working really well. I mean, I know that there was some criticism that maybe we weren't resolving cases as readily and easily. And if you're not in a courtroom talking to the prosecutor directly, it is harder, I suppose. You just have to do the work outside of the courtroom. But maybe that's worth it to sort of stop this spread of this, communicable disease that I think, we had a good grasp on when we were doing it remotely.
So will attorneys be speaking collectively to judges or the chief judge about this to raise a concern?
Yeah, I know the Florida Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers have basically said we want to go back to Zoom. The Supreme Court, which has kind of been the leader in when they issue an edict, then our courthouse will follow it. They've said that they should make Zoom available. It's not mandated at this point. Things aren't closed at this point. And I know a lot of defense attorneys who are basically saying, we want to do Zoom. And I think some judges are allowing that. It's just, there isn't a uniform policy. And I think that's what's sort of disconcerting. If you have to go to court because Judge X doesn't allow Zoom, even if Judge Z allows Zoom, you're kind of stuck at the courthouse. So it's crowded over there. I mean, when you go to an injunction hearing and there's still a lot of people in a courtroom and juvenile court, it's not that different than being in the courthouse pre-pandemic. And, the mask, it's better, but it's not uniformly enforced.
Well, thanks for the update from inside the courthouse. Criminal defense attorney Janet Johnson will continue to follow this. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, if you tune into the cooking channel tonight, you will see some familiar local faces, including Jacksonville chef Kenny Gilbert. He runs Silky's in Springfield. And maybe even our very own WJCT producer, Heather Schatz. What's this all about? Well, Chef Kenny is on the line now to tell us more. Hey, Kenny Gilbert, always good to talk to you. Thanks for being with us.
Hey, good morning. How are you?
Good morning. So you're going to be on the cooking channel tonight on a show called Food Paradise. Tell us all about it.
Oh, gosh. So the O'Malley production company reached out to me a couple of months ago, or several months ago now, and said, hey, we've been checking out your restaurant, and we want to feature you on an episode for Food Paradise. And I was like, wow, that's great. So we scheduled it. They came out May 17th, and we had a huge 12-hour shoot at the restaurant where we were able to bring in some of our favorite fans that enjoy the restaurant. And then they asked me to cook some specific dishes that they've seen comments on online to be featured during the segment.
Now, this is a segment about foods that they call fried and true. Fried foods. So what did you fry up for them?
Well, I still can't mention what I...
oh, you can't tell us?
I can't, no. But what I can say is that it's going to be highlighting the items that we serve on Saturday's daily menus. I can't say that.
Okay, so if people come to Silky's in Springfield, they can check out some of Chef Kenny's delicious menu. Okay, so what was the filming like? You filmed this back in May in the restaurant? Yeah? With some local folks.
Yeah, so what happened was I had to be there at 6 o'clock in the morning. I had to have all the dishes scaled out. We had to have 5, and they wanted 5 full sets of each dish. So it was a lot of prep work involved. And then from there, their team came in, set up cameras, and we did the recipes for, I think we highlighted like 4 or 5 dishes. So it was a lot of pre-taping before all the guests were able to arrive. But it was a lot of fun. It was great to be back in front of the camera and working with the crew. They were amazing.
That's right. You've been on Food Network shows and one on Top Chef. Our own producer, Heather Schatz, and a friend of the show, Renee Parenteau, I think are going to be in the audience on tonight's show. So we'll see some familiar faces.
Yes. And I was very excited to be able to invite some people that I feel that, have been very supportive of me in my career, and also of Silkies in what we do, and to be able to, get them to be able to participate was very exciting. So I'm very happy about it.
Now, it's been a rough road for restaurant owners in this pandemic. Tell us how you've been, and particularly lately with this latest surge of the virus, and how you're dealing with that as a restaurant owner.
Gosh, so when we opened this concept, me and my wife and partner, we discussed what do we think can be sustainable even during this time, and so we started off building it by a takeout model with counter service, so that when you come in, you can place your order. Here's your table number. We've already given you your drink. It's very hands off. Everything is self-serve. The food is delivered to you. And with that model, it's easy for us to basically downscale staff if we have to, if it's really, really slow. And then if it gets busier, we really don't have to add too many more people on. So from that standpoint, labor is usually, one of your biggest killers besides some of your other controllables in the business, but we're able to control it and keep a skeleton crew of people that are dedicated and love what we do. And that way they're always getting their hours because of the way that it's set up. So we've been doing okay. We picked up some caterings, which has been very, very good for us, and amazing. But as far as the restaurant, our the neighbors in Springfield, everyone is very supportive. They come in all the time. So that's been very helpful. I think it's hurting us from people that maybe wanting to drive in from some of the other areas, like during the week, maybe, like whether they're coming in from Ponte Vedra or Oakleaf or Fernandina. We tend to see some of those people coming in over the weekend. But I think right now with the surge, people are scared. I mean, kids are going back to school. We're having to deal with that. And just the fear of going out to eat and being a large crowd, people are fearful of. But they know that they can order takeout through us as well, which has been our model. So I'm even working on I'm actually working on a program where we're going to be able to ship out food from the restaurant, and we're going to have pre-orders set up, and I can literally send you our biscuits, our fried chicken, and everything all throughout the country.
Oh, that's great.
I'm doing it on my own because I've been talking to a lot of people like Gloria Williams, the Foot Nanny out in California. We've been going back and forth talking, and she's like, man, I would love to be able to have your biscuits out here or your fried chicken. And so I've been working on a packaging system to make it where, mail orders are going to be a reality, because I know that, where we are right now, people are, there's going to be another halt to people going out and because of this variant. So I figured I needed to constantly keep looking at ways to generate revenue and keep the staff working.
Absolutely. People can learn a little bit more about this on your website, meatatsilkies.com. It's Silky's Chicken and Champagne Bar in historic Springfield. People have gotten used to this, Kenny, and certainly this is the way to go right now. And it's a good way to support a locally owned business like yours.
Yes, it is. And I'm so grateful and thankful for everyone that comes in. I mean, it's a really hard time. People are at different stress levels, but we're doing everything we can to just cook, good food and diverse food as well for our neighborhood and our community. And the support we've gotten from people coming in on a consistent basis is amazing. I actually celebrated my birthday yesterday, and I had a guest, Greg and Aisha Mundy. They came in earlier. They brought me a gift, and which was a nice surprise, because I was at the restaurant working, and then my wife and some other, friends, and my sous chef, the restaurant. They had a surprise. They had, we got some food catered from one of my favorite restaurants in the town, Patai Thai on King. So Russ sent over a whole buffet of food for me to eat.
Oh, that's great.
It was, yeah. So I really love Jacksonville, and I love I love the community part of it. I mean, sometimes, you don't hear about the really good that actually happens in a lot of
But
places.
there is such a lot of it. Let me not to cut you off, but we have to say goodbye. And I want to mention, tune into the Cooking Channel tonight at 10 o'clock, and it will rerun Thursday morning 2 a.m. And check out Chef Kenny Gilbert of Silky's in Springfield and friends. We'll be watching.
Thank you very much.
And still to come.
And it's a comedy film festival where we bring on local comedians, local filmmakers, local musicians.
LOL Jax, it's Film Festival, and some other good news for your midweek. We'll be right back.
Ascension St. Vincent's. CARE is listening and delivering personalized plans from a team of specialists dedicated to providing the latest technology and treatment at every step. Information and appointments at getjaxhealthcare.com.
Announcing Vickers Landing at Oak Bridge, bridging retirees with an all-new Ponte Vedra Beach community featuring new homes, a resort lifestyle, and a life plan for every stage of aging. Information at vickerslanding.com.
Business Results LLC is committed to helping you coach your teams to their potential. Business Results is the only firm in the U.S. that combines the power of the predictive index with the insights of Catil. BusinessResultsLLC.com.
I'm Robin Young. Director Sean Hayter immersed herself in the world of children of deaf adults, or CODAs, for a new film, and she learned how kids connect their parents to the hearing world.
You're the conduit between these 2 points, and your job is to sort of deliver information and receive information, but in a way you don't know who you are.
Next time, Here and Now.
Today at 1 on WJCT News 89.9.
On the next Fresh Air, Kenan Thompson, nominated for an Emmy for his performances on Saturday Night Live. He's been with the show longer than any cast member in SNL history. He also has an Emmy nomination for his leading role in the NBC sitcom Kenan. He plays a TV talk show host grieving the death of his wife and raising 2 children. Join us.
Today at noon on WJCT News 89.9.
Who owns your identity? For Amanda Knox, she says it shouldn't be Hollywood. She's hitting out at the creators of a new movie which uses her wrongful murder conviction as a plotline. But the film's director says it's not about her. We speak to Amanda Knox next time on 1A.
Today, starting at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
Welcome back. Well, come on out and share a few laughs this weekend at the Mosh Planetarium. It's the LOL Jax Comedy Film Festival. I got a preview from festival co-founder Monique Madrid.
Hey, Monique, tell us about LOL Jax Film Festival.
Well, LOL Jax Film Festival is Love Our Locals While Laughing Out Loud, and it's a comedy film festival where we bring on local comedians, local filmmakers, local musicians, and we partner with local businesses to have a celebration at Mosh. And we have the screenings at the Planetarium, at Brian Gunning Planetarium, and we have an after party on the rooftop August 13th and August 15th.
And this is a great platform for the local film and performing community, it sounds like.
Yeah, it is. It is. It gives them a chance because we've noticed that one, the arts community, not many people feel like they are in touch with it. And then also, too, within the communities, the filmmakers, they have their own little circle. The comedians, they have their own circles. Same thing with the musicians and the artists. They just need to collaborate together because sometimes comedians can be actors in these filmmakers' films, or they can be writers, and the musicians can do the score. And filmmakers, they can actually film the videos or do demo reels for the comedians, but they can all work together. So we wanted to use our platform to kind of bridge everybody together, but also, too, so that the community itself can realize that we have talent in the city. They don't have to wait till Steven Spielberg makes his next film.
Mm-hmm.
We have talented artists right here.
Yeah. And this is going to be comedy. And gosh knows we could all use a few laughs right now.
Yeah, for sure, 100%. And that was the whole purpose. We made LOL Jax we created it back in 2016 with that premise in mind, of people need laughs because they're going through a lot. And unfortunately, here we are, 2021, and we need it now more than ever. So I'm grateful for the gift that comedy and what we do can bring smiles and bring joys to people who are having a bad day, having a bad week, having a bad year, and just going through a lot of different situations. So I'm grateful for that forever gift of giving some positivity back to people who need it.
Now, this is Friday and Sunday at the Mosh in the planetarium. Masks required. What sort of COVID measures are you doing?
Absolutely. So we did this last year. We did an in-person event last year as well, and it's going to be the same protocol. Everyone will have to wear a mask, whether vaccinated or not. We will do temperature checks at the door. We do ask, and it'll be in the program as well, our paper program that we give out, but we ask that people exercise 6 feet, social distancing. We are going to have spread seating. We are doing a limited capacity, and we are ensuring that sanitizer is everywhere, even using the elevators. Not many people can go in the elevators, and so we partner really well with Mosh, and I'm grateful that we are, as well as Mosh, is not only trying to throw a fun event, but also taking the health of everyone seriously. And last year we had several screenings, and we had no COVID issues because we took that protocol seriously. We're even going to have a COVID compliance officer in place to ensure that people are wearing their masks. So we're taking it seriously.
Wow. Thank you so much, and have fun. Monique Madrid, she is co-creator of the LOL Jax Film Festival this Friday and Sunday at the Mosh. Check it out at loljax.com. Have fun.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right, and here's some other good news for your Wednesday. Do you know a talented local artist? The Cultural Council of Greater Jacksonville is now accepting nominations for their 45th Annual Arts Awards in 9 categories. Nominate a talented person in your life at culturalcouncil.org. Speaking of local talent, artist Cassidy Ramos will be at the Cummer Museum this Friday for a meet and greet. This is free with museum admission, and it starts at 5:30 p.m. Pastor Mark Griffin and Wayman Temple AME Church are hosting another 25 for 25 event Saturday. Pastor Griffin and the church are offering a $25 gift certificate to anyone 25 years or under who comes out to get vaccinated. This is in partnership with Agape Family Health. Now, the city of Jacksonville is doing its part, funding 3 new COVID testing sites across the city and 2 additional new sites to be operated by the Duval County Health Department. Find the location nearest you by checking coj.net, or you can look on our website too. And in partnership with Nomi Health, St. Johns County is offering free COVID testing starting Monday at the St. Johns County Agricultural Center. This site will be open 7 days a week with no appointment necessary. So, folks, go on out and get a COVID test if you need it, and please go get vaccinated too if you have not already done so. And if you have some good news for us to put on our weekly What's Good Wednesday menu, just drop us a line. Thanks for listening, too. And thanks to all of our guests and callers, along with producer Heather Schatz, Director Josh Torres, Associate Producer Catherine Hobbs, Editorial Director Jessica Palumbo, and Digital Editor Bill Bortsfield, along with the entire WJCT News team. Get in touch. Our email is firstcoastconnect@wjct.org. Miss anything from today's show? Catch our podcast. It's up later today on all platforms wherever you like to listen. You can also download the WJCT app and listen to all of our great content right through the app. I'm Melissa Ross. This is First Coast Connect on WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. We'll be right back here again at 9 a.m. tomorrow. Be safe, everyone, and please wear your mask.
Support for First Coast Connect is provided by Baptist Health and the North Florida TPO. North Florida TPO, proud sponsor of WJCT's First Coast Connect, bringing to the community innovation in transportation planning, commuter services, clean fuels, and intelligent transportation systems. More at northfloridatpo.com.
Baptist Health is a proud sponsor of First Coast Connect with Melissa Ross. Tune in to WJCT News 89.9 Monday through Friday at 9 a.m. and 8 p.m.
Wayne Hogan of the Terrell Hogan Law Firm.
I'm Wayne Hogan. It's the #1 killer of teens. One text or call can wreck it all. Let's put an end to distracted driving.
Learn more at waynehogan.law.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Ahead in the next 5 minutes, live local news for the First Coast from the WJCT News team.
What happens when the darkest days of your life become someone else's great story idea? From WAMU and NPR in Washington, this is 1A. Hi, I'm Jen White. Today on 1A, Stillwater and Amanda Knox. Knox was the center of a media frenzy in the mid-aughts after she was wrongfully convicted of her roommate's murder during a study abroad in Italy. A Supreme Court later exonerated her, and she was freed after 4 years in prison. A different person was convicted in connection with the killing. But now a new film draws on her story for its central narrative, and it's raising questions about who owns a person's story. We talked to Amanda today, and we want your questions. Email us at 1a@wamu.org or tweet us at 1a.
Live from NPR News, I'm Janine Herbst. Stocks opened higher this morning as the Labor Department reported consumer prices jumped nearly 5.5% in the 12 months ending in July. NPR's Scott Horsley reports the Dow rose more than 190 points in early trading.
Inflation for the year ending in July matched the June rate of 5.4%, which was the highest in nearly 13 years. Higher prices for rent, food, gasoline, and new cars are driving the cost of living higher, but the price of used cars has begun to level off after a sharp increase earlier this year. Monthly price hikes were smaller in July than in previous months, suggesting inflation levels may have peaked. It could take some time, though, to resolve pandemic-related bottlenecks, which are contributing to higher prices. Some businesses are raising prices to help cover the cost of wage increases. The price of restaurant meals jumped 0.8% between June and July. That's the biggest monthly spike in 4 decades. Scott Horsley, NPR News, Washington.
Just a day after passing the $1 trillion infrastructure bill, the Senate very early this morning passed the framework for the $3.5 trillion budget bill with more money for family services, health care, and climate initiatives. Majority Leader Chuck Schumer.
It'll create good-paying jobs while tackling climate change, and it will be paid for by making our tax code more progressive and more fair, asking corporations and the wealthy to pay their fair share.
But Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, who praised the infrastructure bill, is less happy about the budget bill.
After ramming through this reckless taxing and spending spree, here in the dead of night, they also want to start tearing up the ground rules of our democracy and writing new ones, of course, on a purely partisan basis.
He's referring there to a provision that allows Democrats to bypass a Republican filibuster. Some Democrats in the Texas House of Representatives could be subject to arrest now after warrants were issued for them Tuesday night. Matt Largy of member station KUT reports this as they blocked the legislature from passing bills.
Most House Democrats left the Capitol at the beginning of a special legislative session last month. Many spent weeks in Washington, D.C., trying to stop a bill that would change voting laws in Texas, one that they said amounts to voter suppression. Without at least 2/3 of its members present, the Texas House has been legally unable to consider any legislation. On Tuesday, the Texas Supreme Court ruled absent lawmakers are subject to civil arrest, meaning they couldn't be taken to jail or charged with a crime, but they can be forcibly taken to the state Capitol. The House Speaker signed arrest warrants for more than 50 Democrats last night. I'm Matt Largy in Austin.
Wall Street is trading higher at this hour. The Dow is up 188 points. The Nasdaq up 9. S&P 500 also up 9. This is NPR.
And you're listening to WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. I'm Michelle Corum. It's Wednesday, August 11th. Duval County students and teachers who need to quarantine this year because of exposure to COVID will be able to transition to remote learning. WJCT News' Brendan Rivers has more.
The Duval County School District will continue with the health and safety practices it started last year, like regularly cleaning and sanitizing schools and buses, checking temperatures, and social distancing. On top of those measures, students are being asked to wear a face mask unless their parents or guardians opt out. If a student tests positive for COVID-19, they and anyone else who is exposed to them may be required to stay home from school for up to 10 days. Students who are quarantined may be able to participate in school through Microsoft Teams or get assignments through their school counseling office. Brendan Rivers, WJCT News 89.9.
Sheriff Mike Williams has tested positive for COVID-19 and was said to be experiencing minor symptoms from the virus, according to a news release from the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. In its statement last night, the Sheriff's Office clarified that Williams was fully vaccinated before he tested positive. The sheriff is recovering at his home. 84 degrees here downtown in Jacksonville. Few clouds in Jacksonville Beach, and it's 82 in St. Augustine. 30% chance of a mid-afternoon storm today, partly sunny near 90 degrees. Mid to upper 70s tonight.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include iDrive with Remote PC, providing remote access to PCs, Macs, and servers from anywhere, assisting those working from home, and also enabling remote assistance for customers at remotepc.com.
The UF Health Cardiovascular Center, where physicians participate in national and international clinical trials to develop and refine many life-saving and life-enhancing solutions for heart and vascular conditions. Learn more at ufhealthjax.org.
Congaree & Penn, dedicated to agriculture and culinary endeavors, offering field-to-fork dining and outdoor experiences on over 300 acres. Sip, dine, explore. Information at congareeandpenn.com.
This is 1A. I'm Jen White in Washington. Who owns a person's story? That's the question Amanda Knox wants more people to ask. The new film Stillwater, directed by Tom McCarthy and starring Matt Damon, was inspired by Amanda's trial for the murder of her roommate Meredith Kercher in 2007. Amanda was in the eye of an international media frenzy during her trial and spent nearly 4 years in an Italian prison after being wrongfully convicted. She was exonerated in 2015, but since then, the arguably worst time of her life has inspired countless shows, movies, and podcasts. Today, Amanda Knox is a journalist and co-host of the Labyrinth podcast. Amanda, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we should mention there may be spoilers for the film Stillwater in this conversation. Let's start out with when you found out about the film Stillwater and what your gut reaction was.
Well, I found out about it like any other audience member. The trailer came out and suddenly there were headlines saying, hey, a new film about the Amanda Knox story. Mm-hmm. And I thought, wow, yet again, here we go again.
You wrote a Medium post and a viral Twitter thread in response to the film, and in them you take issue with that frame, the Amanda Knox saga. Why is that?
Well, one major reason is that the events that took place in Perugia, the murder of Meredith Kercher, my roommate, were not events that I actually had any hand in. And that's been an ongoing issue for me, and I think an issue in how we frame true crime events in general, is the media and, potentially even the criminal justice system puts a label onto a series of events, but that label doesn't necessarily acknowledge the agency of the people who are actually involved. And the person who really deserves to have their name associated with those tragic events is the actual killer, Rudy Guede, not someone who was peripheral to that story, like myself. So I think that one of the issues I took issue with is that in this story, in this saga, there's been a lot of criticism about how first of all, the victim, the actual victim, Meredith Kercher, has been erased. No one really thinks about her name when they associate with her murder. But furthermore, that I would point out, there's also a forgotten killer in the mix. There is someone who actually committed this crime who a lot of people don't know about. To this day, people reach out to me and say, who do you think really did it? And that just goes to show that the framing of this story has really, really been mishandled.
Stillwater director and co-screenwriter Tom McCarthy has responded to some of your criticisms, and he says, in part, quote, I really empathize with Amanda and what she went through. She was rightfully found innocent and acquitted in Meredith Kercher's case. She has platforms to speak her truth and engage with the media, and she is exercising her absolute right to do so. But by her own account, she hasn't seen Stillwater, and what she seems to be raising feels very removed from the film we actually made. Years ago, I made a film about real-life events called Spotlight, and in that instance, we thoroughly researched and worked closely with the real-life subjects and used real names and events within the film. That was not the case with Stillwater, since it is a work of fiction. The statement goes on from there, but you can read it on our website, the1a.org. Amanda, what's your response to what he says there?
Well, frankly, I think that Tom McCarthy is being very evasive and disingenuous, saying that it is fictionalized because the character isn't named Amanda Knox, but presenting a premise of a story that has very clear and obvious parallels to my own case, and then using my name to promote the film, clearly is making that connection. And so if Tom McCarthy was genuinely trying to empathize with me, he would have thought ahead of time about how his portrayal of me in his film and whether or not he's using my name to promote his film was going to impact me. Because here's the issue, right? Like, I can agree that this story, or the story that he chose to tell, was not about the Amanda Knox character. It was about a father figure who's trying to save an Amanda Knox-like character from a grave injustice. But the way that he chose to fictionalize this story, first of all, erased me from the actual narrative perspective. I was never brought in to discuss how this story would impact me and how what it would feel like to have my own worst trauma dredged up for the sake of entertainment. But furthermore, he decided that as the inciting incident of his story, he was going to take the most superficial and actual false premise of my case that has been put out into the world, that I was somehow involved and morally culpable in the death of my roommate, and used that as the premise of his case. So not only is he sort of hiding behind this, thin veneer of fictionalization, but he's also falsely representing me in the process.
We're talking to Amanda Knox about the new movie Stillwater, which is based on the story of her wrongful murder conviction. In a July interview with Vanity, McCarthy says the film was directly inspired by your story, although he says they decided to, quote, leave the Amanda Knox case behind, but let me take this piece of the story, an American woman studying abroad involved in some kind of sensational crime, and she ends up in jail, and fictionalize everything around it, end quote. How much of a difference do you think it makes if only parts of your story are used as quote-unquote inspiration?
Well, I just go back to that statement, and he says that it is a young woman involved in a sensational crime abroad. I was not involved. I would never should have been brought up in this case in the first place because I didn't do anything. So to frame this story as young woman involved in a salacious case is from the get-go starting off on the wrong foot. And indeed, this is the false and pernicious narrative about this case that continues to be perpetrated, especially by framing this as the Amanda Knox saga. So not only that, but I think that, again, Tom McCarthy is not really considering that he didn't really fictionalize this case all that much. Like, he presented it as, a sexualized relationship between female accused and female victim. Studying abroad, sure, it's France, but it's still Europe. Like, it's so obviously the same story. And sure, it's not like what the main story is about. It's about the dad's perspective. He empathized with the dad's perspective, but he didn't consider. And I think it's interesting that he chose to go out of his way to go to Oklahoma and meet men who are going to feel represented by the Matt Damon character. But he didn't do that same gesture to the very person who is going to be most recognized by this case. And through my name, right? So like, for me, I think that the main issue that I took was not that he decided to take my story as inspiration. Honestly, I understand that people have done that before. People will do it again. It's a crazy story of what I went through. So I understand that a fiction, like someone would want to take that story as a premise for a fiction. But if you're going to do that, actually fictionalize it, or have some accountability for how it is going to directly impact my life. And I think that Tom McCarthy wants to say, well, because it's fiction, I don't have to be accountable to Amanda because I never actually used her name in the film. But that, I don't think that that is being very honest about what the impact is going to be.
It's interesting because you and Tom McCarthy, the two of you, are having this kind of conversation through media. And
unfortunately.
Not directly. You invited him to sit down on your podcast. If you do get a chance to sit down with him, what do you want to ask him?
I genuinely want to have a conversation. So I don't want to put him on the spot. That's not my style. I've been put on the spot a million times before, and I'm not about to recreate the interrogation room for someone else. But what I do want to invite him to consider is that he overlooked my humanity in this case. And if that is the case, and he did so with the best of intentions, then why is it that that continues to be an ongoing issue, especially in Hollywood, where inspired by true event stories are often recreated in that space, and whether or not people who find themselves at the center of those stories should be a part of their development. And it's interesting. I had a conversation with New Zealand radio yesterday, and they brought up the fact that there was going to be a film made about the Christchurch massacre, and how there was a big controversy over this because no one from the film had asked anyone from the Muslim community there about the development of that film. And that was a great oversight. And it's interesting that we have that oversight here because I think Hollywood is having a sort of awakening to how there has been cultural appropriation before in the past in storytelling, how people and stories and identities and narratives have been appropriated and misappropriated in the process because people who find themselves represented in those stories weren't a part of the development. They weren't a part of the authorship of those stories. And wow, what an incredible injustice that was. But we have yet to consider that individuals whose life experiences, for whatever reason, ended up in the cultural zeitgeist, they also potentially deserve to have some kind of authorship in that narrative.
Is this a conversation you'd be willing to have with him in private, or do you feel like that conversation needs to be a public one?
It doesn't have to be a public one, but I do think that it is one that if it only happened in a private space, it would only, it would definitely bridge a gap between me and this person. But I would love for this to be a more broader conversation, which is actually why I made the Twitter thread in the first place. I wasn't necessarily expecting Tom McCarthy to directly respond. I more wanted it to be a opening for other people, even those who are going to see this film, like, hey, consider this is something we've never had to think about before.
We're talking to Amanda Knox about the responsibility of fictionalizing true stories. Nicole emailed this: I peripherally followed Amanda's case and have now heard her speak on several shows. I've been very impressed by her articulate and deliberate stance on this issue. I hope she understands how powerful her voice is. We'll be back with more in a moment. I'm Jen White. This is 1A from WAMU and NPR.
The way manufacturers label foods can be a bit patchy.
They're just, essentially making it up or making an educated guess. And that's where most of these dates come from.
I'm Amy Scott. Expiration dates next time on Marketplace.
Tonight at 6 on WJCT News 89.9.
Nearly 3 years ago, former CIA Director Michael Hayden had a stroke, which affected his ability to communicate. Despite his struggles, he considers himself lucky.
Every once in a while, I'm sad, okay? But mainly, no, I want to do more.
Living with aphasia, this afternoon on All Things Considered from NPR News.
Starting at 4 on WJCT News 89.9.
A priest in northern Iraq says his town was always a home for Christians.
Since the 3rd or 4th century after Christ, and continued like that till 1980.
That's when Saddam Hussein started changing the demographics. Then, more recently, came ISIS. Today, Iraqi Christians are hanging on to their homeland. It's on the world.
This afternoon at 3, here on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from the NPR Wine Club, bringing the wine world to people's homes with stories on each bottle and wines inspired by NPR shows like Weekend Edition Merlot, available to adults 21 years or older at nprwineclub.org. And from Atlassian, makers of teamwork software like Jira, Confluence, and Trello, committed to moving work forward for millions of people, thousands of teams, and hundreds of the Fortune 500. Atlassian.com.
I'm Jen White. This is 1A. We're talking with exoneree Amanda Knox about the new film Stillwater. It's based on the story of her wrongful conviction and imprisonment for the murder of her roommate while on study abroad in Italy. Amanda is now a journalist and co-host of the podcast Labyrinths. So as you said, Amanda, no one reached out to you during the making of this film. But I'm curious, would you have been interested in that conversation, or what type of conversation would you have wanted to have?
Certainly. I mean, like I said, again, I'm not precious about what happened to me in the sense that I don't think that I'm the only person who can author a story that is about this kind of issue. What I take issue with is the way that Tom McCarthy, first of all, overlooked the fact that I might have any perspective about how this film portrays an Amanda Knox character, how this film would portray the experience of someone who was locked up abroad for a crime that they didn't commit. And the fact that he just decided to fictionalize away that pesky detail of my innocence to make a more compelling fictionalized story. But I think also I wanted him to consider I think I would love for there to be more of a conversation in Hollywood about the stories of victims, because I think that Hollywood sort of has a problem with victims. Victims don't if you think of a story that about a crime, for instance, we tend to focus on who had agency, the actual killer, for instance. They're the more plotty-driven character, and Hollywood usually frames either the victim as someone who had no agency whatsoever, or if they did have agency, it was because it was somehow their fault that they were victimized. There's victim blaming. And I think that a victim story can actually be very compelling. It's something that I explore a lot in my podcast Labyrinths, where I talk to people who have had something horrible happen to them, something overwhelming that they had to just react to in the moment. And the process of reacting and processing trauma is actually a very heroic tale, but one that doesn't really translate in Hollywood terms to the guy who shoots him up and respond, that kind of thing. So, I think that, especially when I think about how Tom McCarthy says, well, Amanda, you haven't actually seen the film, so you don't know what you're talking about. Well, Tom McCarthy, you made a film about the worst experience of my life. It's not something that I, would casually go and on a Friday night to go hang out with my friends and see. This is a very serious thing for me that dredges up very serious trauma. So if you're going to be portraying that story, consider that, first of all, it is going to be dredging up that for me, but also the way that you represent me is going to be it's going to be a part of this ongoing story, because my trauma isn't just that I went to prison for something I didn't do. It was that the world defined me as something that I wasn't. And that continues to be an ongoing trauma that I and other exonerees face, because the stigma of being accused is a very real stigma that doesn't go away. To have your name forever associated with a series of events that you had nothing to do with, that is traumatizing. And I would have told him that if he had talked to me, and I would have said, hey, you know what's a different story that's worth telling? The story of how someone survives that experience and moves on with their life. That's an interesting story that no one has really ever bothered to look into, because it's not the obvious story that was portrayed in the media, the slanderous story.
You have on one hand the actual product that's being made, the film, the television series. But I find myself thinking about the marketing of projects as well. Ripped from the headlines, inspired by true events. And so while a film or a television show may say, any similarities to real events are completely unintentional.
Yeah.
But the marketing around those shows, those films, those television series stand right beside that marketing that says ripped from the headlines.
Yep.
How do you think about, that line and that sort of, I guess, workaround in a way that Hollywood has developed?
Yeah. So I think that is an unfortunate legal workaround, like you said, where you basically Hollywood wants its cake and wants to eat it too. It wants to be able to say, oh, that thing that you've heard about, we're telling that story. Don't you want, we're basically going to be taking all of that interest that has already been built up from the true events of a situation, and we're not going to be accountable to those who are actually involved in that real life event. So we're just going to enjoy the fruits of that interest, but we're also going to not be at all accountable to those who are involved. And that is, I think, an unfortunate legal issue. I'm not a legal expert, but I do think that those who say that because it's in the public interest, because it's in the public eye, it suddenly is something that they are entitled to, is wrong, honestly. I think that we need to change how we deal with true events, true life stories, because to act like we are all entitled to that story however we want to, fictionalizing it above all, presenting the most superficial version of that story, that comes at a real cost. And the real cost is to those who are not empowered to tell their story, people who are not big Hollywood producers who get to make millions of dollars off of these stories. They're people who live with the consequences of humiliation and shame and stigma, and who are not offered the opportunity to be authors of their own stories.
Let's listen to a voicemail we received. This is Jennifer from Florida.
I think that it is horrific that she was not consulted on her own personal story, and I do believe that she deserves a public apology and to be compensated for the use of her own narrative in this movie.
You said, Amanda, that you aren't looking to be litigious about the use of your story, but what are you interested in? Is it just about reclaiming the narrative, or is it an apology? Is it compensation?
I mean, again, I would have to say that when I wrote my Twitter thread, I was not expecting the world to blow up about it, honestly, because I have been speaking about this issue for a long time. I've written about it before, how how my life has been turned into other people's entertainment content and the problems with that, because it doesn't just happen to me, it happens to other real life people. My goal was to have a conversation that would change the culture around real life stories that empower people who have been previously disempowered through the narratives that the media or, Hollywood or the criminal justice system writes about them. So for me, I've been tackling this issue usually from the true crime angle, because that's the one that I'm most familiar with in my podcast, The Truth About True Crime, and now with Labyrinths. I've really been asking myself, who has the most at stake in a story about a horrific event? And I've wanted to put those voices at the center of the telling of those stories because a lot of times those are the people who are erased. And I think that this is not just a problem with true crime, it's a problem with stories in general that are, like you said, ripped from the headlines. Because when you hide behind the veil of fictionalization, suddenly you don't have to think about being accurate or humanizing all the characters involved. They can become characters in a morality play where you get to decide who's the villain and who's the hero. And a lot of times reality is a lot more complicated than that. So I guess my goal in all of this was simply to continue that same process of addressing what I see as a void in the public awareness about how stories are told and why they are told and who gets to be the author of those stories. And I was hoping that having a direct conversation with the people who had basically violated that or crossed the line with that with me would be an opening, a cognitive opening for the industry. If that doesn't happen, that's okay, because honestly, the fact that you're talking to me today is an opportunity for there to be a cognitive opening for someone else in Hollywood potentially. And I really hope that that happens. So that's my goal. We'll see what ends up happening. But my door is still always open to Tom McCarthy, Matt Damon, all the people who are instrumental to the film, because I'm not in the business of being angry at people, very honestly. I'm definitely more of a person who believes in restorative justice and who lives by those principles of building bridges and finding understanding even when there has been harm committed. And I think that if I'm capable of doing that, he should be able to too.
Well, this isn't the first time a film or show has used your story as content. There was a 2011 true crime Lifetime movie. In 2016, there was a Netflix documentary. How often are you contacted by productions? And how do you make a decision about how you respond?
So I was only ever contacted by the Netflix documentary filmmakers. And one of the things that I really appreciated about their approach to this story was, first of all, they said, we're not going to tell this story without you because this is going to directly impact you and your perspective matters in this. So yes, we've got years of footage that we've been collecting, and it would be a great loss for us if we didn't get to make this film, but we're not going to make it if you're not able to be a part of it. And I appreciated that because it really, they understood the stakes. And furthermore, when they were talking to me about this case, they weren't just asking me about what happened then and what happened then, what's the next plot point. They were asking me what I thought and felt about what happened, which is truly what gets at the heart of the human experience of these tragic stories. And they used what I had to say as part of the framing of the Netflix documentary. So I really appreciate the fact that they not only were interested in what happened to me, but they were interested in my perspective. Now, all the other, inspired by Amanda Knox stuff, the novels, the TV shows, the films, I was not approached at all. And I only found out about it in the same way that I found out about Stillwater when yet another headline came out saying, hey, here's a new film that's inspired by Amanda Knox. So it's not like I'm even going out of my way.
What does that do to you, though, when you are on social media or you see a commercial for something and your name pops up?
Well, it is the ongoing trauma that I experience. Having had my identity stolen, so not just my innocence and my freedom stolen, but my identity. My identity was stolen from me the minute that I was arrested and accused of a crime that I didn't commit. And it has yet to be fully restored to me because the rest of the world has decided who I am, what my story means, and they feel free and entitled to use it however which way they want, regardless of the consequences to me. And I think that is, it just means that I'm still in the thick of it. I'm still surviving an ongoing trauma, and I am doing the very best I can with what I have, but it does mean that I'm living in a world that's still very surreal and very unfair to me.
We're talking to Amanda Knox about the new movie Stillwater, which is based on the story of her wrongful murder conviction. We're also hearing from you. Charlotte from Kentucky emails how interesting it would be to read an essay and see a film rendition of this story, not focusing on the nightmare of you being held in prison far from home for a crime you did not commit, but for living with the sensationalizing of your story by strangers who are capitalizing on it. And here's Mary from Minneapolis.
I'm an editor and I work with writers of fiction and nonfiction. My memoir writers are always asking me, do I need a memory? Do I need to corroborate everything? How do I write creative nonfiction, as it's called? I think of it as an outline. So the things you can support are the bullet points, and you need firsthand information for that, whether it's somebody else's memory, a journal, a photograph. You can embellish or add some texture to the bullet points within reason. Moving bullet points, inventing them, I think that takes creative license a little bit too far. There's a stigma, like the use of AI to replicate Anthony Bourdain's voice in the movie Roadrunner, that's kind of put this issue front and center. It's definitely murky territory, and each writer or creator has to find their own comfort level if they want to wrap it in the label of nonfiction or even creative nonfiction.
Thanks for sharing your perspective, Mary. We also want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on the line between fact and fiction when it comes to media and entertainment? You can comment on our Facebook page, tweet us at 1A, or send us an email at 1A@WAMU.org. I mean, Amanda, in hearing from Mary there, for you, where is that line between using a story as inspiration and taking something that doesn't belong to you?
Well, I think what's interesting about what Mary was suggesting here was she was talking about creative nonfiction. So the acknowledgement that there is a real story and a real person behind that is represented in that story. What Tom McCarthy has suggested is that what he did was fiction, and therefore he is free from any kind of accountability to the real events of a case. And I think that what he was doing, though, was he was doing creative nonfiction, and doing so even doing creative nonfiction in an unethical way, which was by changing things so that they would misrepresent reality, and also claiming that he didn't have to be accountable to reality. And I think that is where you draw the line. Like, the question I always ask myself as a storyteller, because I'm a storyteller myself, is I ask myself, who has the most at stake in what I am representing? And if that is true, if there are infinite stories that I can tell, am I being responsible to what kind of consequences are there to my storytelling? And what I think, very honestly, is that Tom McCarthy didn't think there would be consequences to me in his telling of his story. He just overlooked that fact. And I'm more interested in the question of why is it that good-intentioned people can overlook the humanity of certain individuals in society. And I think part of it is because the way that my own experience has been portrayed in the media is one in which I'm just a character. I'm not even really a person. And so it's easy to overlook the fact that I am a person who has a vested interest in and a perspective that is worth looking into and telling.
Well, Jeff from Syracuse emailed this. I think that movies that are based on a true story must have very specific disclaimers or be held accountable. Even two critically acclaimed movies by director Ava DuVernay took liberties that were factually inaccurate. This does a disservice to the viewer and to the people involved. Another of you tweeted this: whether externally or self-imposed, notoriety is not easily managed, nor can it be. We don't own the story, it owns us. To think otherwise is fantasy. We're discussing the line between fact and fiction with Amanda Knox. I'm Jen White. More from you and our guests in a moment.
Yeah. It's fade, hit the brakes, man, I'm done switching lanes, just looking for a reason. And you call shotgun, and I see it in the back of my mind. A prima donna, it don't kill my body high. White time, got his Nikes on, running so fast you gon' kill someone. And last time I checked who my friend is, don't depend on a stimulant. And the daydreams sting like sunburn, 18 and ain't getting younger. White time, got his Nikes on.
I'm Robin Young. Director Sean Hayter immersed herself in the world of Children of Deaf Adults, or CODAS, for her new film, and she learned how kids connect their parents to the hearing world.
You're the conduit between these 2 points, and your job is to sort of deliver information and receive information, but in a way you don't know who you are.
Next time, Here and Now.
Today at 1 on WJCT News 89.9.
On the next Fresh Air, Kenan Thompson, nominated for an Emmy for his performances on Saturday Night Live. He's been with the show longer than any cast member in SNL history. He also has an Emmy nomination for his leading role in the NBC sitcom Kenan. He plays a TV talk show host grieving the death of his wife and raising 2 children. Join us.
Today at noon on WJCT News 89.9.
Hospitals are being overwhelmed by a surge in cases of COVID-19. In Arkansas and elsewhere, nurses aren't just exhausted.
There was an antidote to this, and it's difficult not to become angry.
A growing number of Americans say they're done with the reasons or excuses given by those who are still resistant to getting vaccinated. How do we deal with that anger? That's next time on 1A.
Today at 11 on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Aspiration, a digital banking alternative designed for people who care about the environment. Customers can plant a tree with every swipe of their debit card to offset their carbon footprint. Aspiration.com/green. And from Posh Virtual Receptionists, a 24/7 team of live U.S.-based receptionists available to answer calls and schedule appointments for businesses because people can't be in 2 places at once. More at posh.com.
This is 1A. Back to Amanda Knox in a moment, but first we'd love your help with our show about COVID and summer travel. Millions of trips were put on hold last year as COVID-19 spread around the world. Now, travelers are hitting the roads, skies, and waters yet again, but another wave of a more transmissible COVID variant is complicating plans. Are you taking a trip soon? If so, why? If you put your plans on hold, tell us why. And how has the pandemic factored into your decision-making? Leave us a voicemail, 855-236-1A1A. What questions do you have about how to travel safely? Send them our way and we'll put them to the experts. 855-236-1A1A. Or you can send us an audio file with our app, 1A Vox Pop, and we'll share some of your stories and questions tomorrow on 1A. Now let's get back to our conversation with Amanda Knox about the new film Stillwater. It's based on the story of her wrongful conviction and imprisonment for the murder of her roommate Meredith Kercher while on study abroad in Italy. Amanda is now a journalist and co-host of the podcast Labyrinths. Amanda, yesterday on the show we talked to Curtis Flowers. He's a black man from Mississippi. He spent 23 years behind bars, was tried 6 times for quadruple homicide in 1996, and then in 2019 the Supreme Court overturned his conviction, and last year Mississippi dropped the charges against him, and he's finally a free man. His story made it through to the podcast In the Dark, this investigative podcast, just through a chance letter someone wrote to the podcast that said, hey, you should look at this story. They did, and that started the series of events that ended with him being freed. Mm-hmm. But in talking to him, he talked about how difficult it was to put his life back together, and had it not been for this just chance letter landing on the desk of the host, he would likely still be in prison, possibly dead, because he was on death row.
Yeah.
How do you think about who gets a chance to tell their story, especially when we think about race, gender, age, how all of those identities intersect with that power to even have a chance to try to reclaim your story?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the really scary things that is a reality of the media industry is that it is a industry. It is not just, we like to think that media is just a tool that is meant to be in the public interest. And if that were the case, then we would hear a lot more stories about all of these wrongfully convicted Black men who are being, thrown under being forgotten in this and it takes years and decades for them to be released, even though there is absolutely obvious, especially in the case of Curtis Flowers, where he is, he's not found guilty 6 times in a row. Let's call it quits. So what is considered in the public interest is not just what is of public interest, but what is sellable, what is salacious, and what grabs people's attention. And unfortunately, that is very much influenced by people's biases and how quote sexy a story seems and a character seems to the people involved. And in my case, it's interesting, my own case has a lot of the same problems with how I was wrongfully convicted, but that's not what people remember about it. They remember the sex scandal part of the story. They remember that it's 2 young women who are accused, like a young woman who is accused of hurting another young woman, which is so unheard of and salacious. They don't think about how what happened to me is actually just an echo of what is happening to mostly men in this country, especially impoverished men, disenfranchised men. The same kinds of methods that were used to convict me are used to convict them, but you don't hear about them because it's just, yet another story that that doesn't catch people's eye and therefore doesn't get the headline.
Jay from Oklahoma emails this. The 3rd season of American Crime Story focuses on retelling the impeachment of Bill Clinton, but is involving Monica Lewinsky as a co-producer. What kind of influence does that role give a victim on how her part of the story is presented?
Well, first of all, it's an acknowledgement that her perspective matters. I think Monica has been a tremendous model for me in someone who has reclaimed their narrative, especially because she didn't really have a model before her. She was having to find her own way in a world that was satisfied to humiliate and degrade her as a young woman. And it wasn't until she was, over a decade later that she felt like she could have a voice again. And I think that it is it's a huge justice to her to give her the opportunity to share her perspective in the development of a project like this. And I think it's one that it's a kind of justice that Hollywood wants to be doing. I think that we want to be hearing the stories of people and from the people who have been erased historically. And I think that so we see that happening, but at the same time, we see the same stakes happening over and over again because we haven't fully wrapped our minds around how exploitative storytelling can be and in what cases it is. So I'm just trying to point out that it continues to be an ongoing problem and that we can do better because we want to do better.
Aaron tweets this. My question moves us into the ethics of creating biopics on those who have passed. What does Amanda Knox think about this? How do we fill in history's gaps with creative license?
That's a really fascinating question. And I think that, again, it goes back to, as a storyteller, ask yourself, why are you going and telling this story? And ask yourself, is there someone who has a perspective that hasn't been heard yet that is important to hear, to understand this historical context better? And is that important, not just for the sake of it being an entertaining journey for an audience, but is there some good that can be done with a new telling and a new frame that is grounded in a new perspective?
You speak to people, as you said, who are struggling to reclaim their narrative in your podcast Labyrinths, and you spoke to Samantha Geimer, who was sexually assaulted by Roman Polanski as a child. Let's listen.
It was almost as if the minute my mother called the police, everything just snowballed out of control into this huge monster that we couldn't escape. Almost immediately, because of the high-profile nature, I felt like I was at the mercy of powerful men who didn't care about me. They were just using this case, especially the judge, for his own benefit, for his own publicity. And it was clear no one was interested in actual justice or actual truth or helping me as the victim in the crime. I was irrelevant.
What was it about Samantha's case that spoke to you?
Honestly, Samantha reached out to me. Samantha reached out to me after I can't even remember exactly what tweet that I had done. Some tweet commenting upon how my story was being stolen. It's an ongoing thing that I've been talking about for a long time. And she reached out and said, "Girl, I know what that feels like." And I said, "I want to talk to you." And when I talked to her, I was just so blown away by how, yet again, this is another young woman, that she was 13 when she was assaulted by Roman Polanski, and how she had grappled over decades and decades of being basically turned into a black and white fiction of herself by multiple forces. And, you know, again, well-meaning or not well-meaning, some people who have a lot of ego and reputation and career at stake. But on the one hand, some really loud voices wanted her to be the Lolita who had seduced an innocent Hollywood producer or filmmaker. And other people wanted her to be the innocent victim who deserved so Roman Polanski deserved to spend the rest of his life in jail. And what she wanted, what she needed for her own healing, was not represented in either of those depictions of her that was put out into the world. And indeed, good on her, she went and found her own justice. She went and had a conversation with Roman Polanski in which he expressed accountability, and she was the one who was determined to define who she was and what her own narrative was, and to not be the pawn or plot device in anyone else's story. It took 20, 30 years, and to this day, it still is a ongoing process for her, because district attorneys in LA dredge up her trauma and ignore her voice in the courtroom, especially when it comes to their decision about how and when to prosecute. And I think that she is a very interesting voice that goes against what we expect victims of rape to want and be like. And I think that that's important, because societal expectations about what a victim should be like and what a victim should want is one of the traumatic experiences of being a victim, is being told this is what is good for you, and not what you are expressing is good for you. And I think that's one of the major reasons why a lot of victims, especially of sexual assault, don't come forward, because they anticipate that their wants and needs and identity is going to be stolen from them.
We're talking with Amanda Knox about the new film Stillwater and Responsible Storytelling. We're also hearing from you.
I'm calling from Watertown, Massachusetts, where the Boston Marathon bombers got into a shootout with police back in 2013. And this movie reminds me a lot of the movies Patriots Day and Deepwater Horizon, both with Mark Wahlberg and directed by Peter Berg. These movies are inaccurate, exploitative, and harmful, telling some twisted, basic Hollywood version of some real devastating events of human tragedy and suffering. It shares a distorted image of real events with a large audience, ultimately only benefiting very few people. It's one thing to take the time to accurately portray historical events in a fictionalized story, but this is basic exploitation that in my view is actively harmful.
What do you hope storytellers keep in mind when they draw inspiration from true events that are traumatic for those involved? You've talked about making sure you are involving people in the process, but in the act of storytelling, what are some of the key things you think people should remember?
Well, first and foremost, storytellers are not entitled to other people's stories. I think that there are infinite stories that anyone can tell as a storyteller, and so if you are going to choose to tell someone else's story, understand that just because you are empowered to do so doesn't mean that you are actually entitled to do so. So keeping that in mind, putting that humbleness and understanding the responsibility that you have in conveying another human's story and identity to a vast audience, that is something that all storytellers should keep in mind. And I think that that humility would do great service to the story as well.
We've also been hearing from a lot of people who are writers and readers. Here's Sebastian from Tucson.
I think historical fiction can be really interesting. I used to read it a lot as a kid, and most of the time it was very small characters, people that wouldn't really affect too much of history, sort of being present when it happened and giving us a view into how it happened, what happened during this event from a more personal standpoint. But I think that sometimes historical fiction goes a bit too far, especially when it comes to the case of historical revisionism. I think we shouldn't have to fill in the blanks of events. I think we should just have different perspectives on them told through this historical fiction angle.
Sebastian, thanks for that message. You know, Amanda, we've talked about the role you think Hollywood should play, what writers should think about when they're telling these stories. But what about for the viewer, the reader? I will admit I have more than once found myself sitting in front of a marathon of a certain crime show ripped from the headlines. But what should we keep top of mind when we're engaging in that content?
I think that above all, storytelling does take creative license because even just in media, this isn't an issue because what ultimately storytellers want to do is they want to engage you. They want to inspire emotion in you. And one of the easiest way to do that is to trigger these very instinctual responses to good and evil, to judgment, to what's the next exciting plot point. And reality does not actually isn't well represented in that space. You have to gloss over some nuance in order to convey the villain character. You have to forget some of the complicating factors that led to the hero character making the decisions that they made. And I think that, again, especially that was an interesting observation about historical fiction where, it's first of all, a lot of times historical fiction is coming from the perspective of someone who has been overlooked in history. That's, I think, a really great example and use of historical fiction. But again, when it's in the public interest to tell a story, you also have to be, as a viewer, you have to understand what they're trying to tell you. They're trying to. It's not just that they're representing a story, they're representing real events, but they are trying to trigger emotions in you that are based upon the actual act of storytelling itself. Like the hero's journey is a narrative arc that is returned back to over and over again. And I guess I would just say that as a viewer, don't assume that because you've seen the Hollywood version that you have an understanding of what really happened. And in fact, probably you have a skewed understanding of what really happened for the sake of the entertainment experience. Reality is a lot more complicated than it is entertaining. And if anything, if the best kind of storytelling, I think, is one that embraces that nuance because it gets you thinking as opposed to just having a good time and then walking away from the theater.
In just a sentence or two, Amanda, what's next for you?
I'm continuing to work on my podcast Labyrinths, and I'm looking forward to Parenthood.
Congratulations. That's Amanda Knox, exoneree, journalist, and co-host of the Labyrinths podcast. Amanda, thanks for speaking with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Remember, we have a text club and we'll only ever send you one text a day. It's the fastest way to connect with us. Details about how to sign up can be found in the Ask 1A tab at the1a.org. Today's producer was Michelle Harvin. This program comes to you from WAMU, part of American University in Washington, distributed by NPR. I'm Jen White. Thanks for listening. This is 1A.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Raymond James, a firm focused on transforming lives, businesses, and communities through tailored wealth management, banking, and capital markets solutions. Learn more at raymondjames.com. From Noom, a personalized weight loss program designed to give people knowledge to set new goals and the tools to stick to them for good. Learn more at Noom, Noom.com. And from the listeners who support this NPR station.
Summer travel plans are in limbo for millions of people. As checklists grow, more obstacles are being put in the way of you getting to your final destination. Wearing a mask is the easy part. But how safe is it to travel? And what are your best options for a break this summer? Some tips as we answer your questions on the next 1A.
This is Ira Glass of This American Life. Every week on our show, we apply the tools of journalism to stories that are so small and personal, journalists normally would not cover them.
It was my forged signature, and it was my boyfriend's handwriting.
Or we look at stories that are big. Refugees, school segregation in America, the split in the Republican Party.
Climbing out from the smoking ruin and say, anybody else alive around here?
And find surprising personal stories there, too. This American Life.
Saturday afternoon at 1, here on WJCT News 89.9.
Groove to Electro Lounge Radio around the clock. Allow the sounds of chill out, down-tempo, new jazz, and reggae to relax and inspire you. Download the WJCT app or visit wjct.org/jacksmusic to start listening today.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Ahead in the next 5 minutes, live local news for the First Coast from the WJCT News team.
In the age of coronavirus, there's a lot to be mad about. But what are we supposed to do with that rage? From WAMU and NPR in Washington, this is 1A. Hi, I'm Jen White. About half of the United States is vaccinated, and the other 50% is a mix of people: the immunocompromised, children under 12 who can't get the shot, and then eligible adults who refuse to get it. As the Delta variant rages on, the rage towards those who can and won't inoculate themselves grows too. So where does that leave those who are tired and frustrated as the pandemic draws closer to the 2-year mark? If you find yourself just plain mad, we want to hear from you. Email us at 1a@wamu.org or tweet us at 1a.
Live from NPR News, I'm Janine Herbst. A new poll shows parents in the U.S. are more likely to support mask requirements in schools than COVID-19 vaccination mandates for their children. NPR's Selena Simmons-Duffin reports on the findings from the nonpartisan Kaiser Family Foundation.
Nearly 2/3 of parents of school-aged children said that yes, unvaccinated students and staff should be required to wear masks at school. But a slim majority of parents did not think schools should require students to get a COVID-19 vaccine if they're age 12 or older. The Kaiser Family Foundation surveyed more than 1,200 parents from mid-July to August 2nd. The political divide is clear in the results. Republicans were more resistant to interventions compared to Democrats. Another finding: more than 3/4 of parents say they trust their pediatrician for COVID vaccine information, but most haven't actually talked to their pediatrician about it. Selena Simmons-Duffin, NPR News.
After an all-night session, Democrats early this morning approved the framework for a $3.5 trillion spending plan, one of President Biden's top economic priorities. NPR's Asma Khalid has more.
It has a lot more money for things like childcare, healthcare, climate change, a lot of Democratic priorities, but it's going to take a while to work out the details before it actually comes up for a final vote. The tricky thing is, Democrats say they're going to pass this budget bill and the infrastructure bill in tandem, but they have such small majorities in both chambers, it could be difficult to keep all the members in line. And still, the president has said he is confident these two bills will pass.
NPR's Asma Khalid. This just a day after the Senate passed a nearly $1 trillion infrastructure bill. The Pacific Northwest is preparing for another heat wave, the second one this summer. From member station KUOW, Casey Martin has more from Seattle.
People in Seattle are still talking about the last heat wave in June, when temperatures climbed above 100 degrees. This week, temperatures are expected to top out in the mid-90s in the area. But that's still very unusual for the region. The National Weather Service has issued an extreme heat watch, and the city of Seattle is opening cooling centers for people who need them. Outreach workers will hit the streets Wednesday, encouraging people experiencing homelessness to get out of the heat. During June's heat wave, the Washington Department of Health says at least 129 people died of heat-related causes. For NPR News, I'm Casey Martin in Seattle.
Consumer prices were higher in July. The Labor Department says prices were up 5.4% year over year. Measured on a month-to-month basis, the CPI rose 0.5% last month. It's all in line with analysts' expectations. Gas prices were up, but other things like the price of a used car were down, dropping 0.2% from June. Wall Street's trading in mixed territory at this hour. You're listening to NPR News.
It's 11:04. This is WJCT News 89.9 in Jacksonville. I'm Michelle Corum. Jacksonville is going to use $4 million to open 5 new sites for free COVID-19 testing and vaccinations starting as soon as Monday, according to a report from our partner, the Florida Times Union. Jacksonville City Council gave emergency approval last night for using a portion of its federal recovery money on sites operated in partnership with Agape Family Health, Telescope Health, and the State Department of Health. The Lane Wiley Senior Center, these are the 5, the Clansel T. Brown Community Center, the Emmett Reed Community Center, and the Cuba Hunter Community Center. All will provide testing and vaccinations on a walk-up basis. The 5th site at the beaches will have drive-through testing only at the former Kmart Shopping Center site in Neptune Beach. 2 separate shark bites in 1 week span on beaches near Savannah, Georgia are somewhat unusual since the area sees relatively few bites each year. A lifeguard on South Carolina's Hilton Head Island suffered deep cuts to the chest but is expected to survive after being bitten August 3rd. At nearby Tybee Island, Georgia, a well-known surfing instructor was bitten July 27th. South Carolina recorded just 1 unprovoked shark bite last year. Georgia had none, according to the Florida Museum of Natural History's International Shark Attack File. And temperatures now in the low 80s.
Support for NPR comes from iDrive, providing cloud backup, full system backup, and on-site iDrive appliance to protect PCs, Macs, and servers from data loss due to crashes and ransomware at iDrive.com/NPR. And Americans for the Arts.
The Jacksonville Music Experience from WJCT Public Media is your ticket to the local scene. Music reviews, curated playlists, music history, concert recommendations, profiles of local artists, and more. Turn your ear on the beautiful noise emerging from Northeast Florida and learn more about the local artist whose music is reverberating across the country. Visit jaxmusic.org to play it local and play it loud.
This is 1A. I'm Jen White in Washington. We're 18 months into the pandemic, and people are tired. They're frustrated, they're angry, and they've had enough. The country is averaging more than 124,000 new coronavirus cases a day. That's the highest rate since February. The surge we're seeing now can't be divorced from the fact that nearly 1/3 of eligible Americans are unvaccinated, and some continue to resist the public health guidance on masking. Few people want to be where we are now, but it feels like those who are vaccinated have reached a breaking point with those who are choosing not to be. The question now isn't whether the anger some people are feeling is valid. It's more about what we do with it. And how do we find a way forward when a difference in opinion is costing lives? That's what we're unpacking today, and we'd love to hear from you. How are you feeling about where we are now? If you're angry or frustrated with the situation, we want to know why. You can comment on our Facebook page, tweet us at 1A, or send us an email at 1A@WAMU.org. Joining us now is Dr. Alicia Moreland Capuia. She's the Executive Director of Trauma-Informed Treatment, Consultation, and Outreach at the Center of Excellence in Depression and Anxiety Disorders. Dr. Moreland Capuia, welcome back.
Thank you so much for having me.
Also with us today, Alexandra Solomon. She's a clinical psychologist at the Family Institute at Northwestern University. She specializes in families, marriages, and relationships. Alexandra, it's always great to have you on.
Wonderful to be with you again.
So we're in a different place than we were last summer. We have a vaccine now, and at one point the CDC relaxed its guidelines. Alexandra, it felt like we were beginning to see some light at the end of the tunnel, and that light dimmed pretty fast. What's the impact of that kind of emotional whiplash?
I think that's a beautiful and powerful way of saying it, emotional whiplash, that we're entering this chapter of our pandemic journey without our full strength and our full capacity, right? We had been experiencing some hope, maybe putting things in the rearview mirror. And the thing that we know about grief is that grief chains together. So the grief that we're experiencing, that is, of course, grief mixed with anger and mixed with fear, this grief is not fresh, right? It's tied to our memories and our pain points from the earlier chapters of this journey in the pandemic, and of course from earlier experiences in our lives.
Dr. Morlin Capuia, the experience of living in a pandemic could be considered a collective trauma. What does trauma do to the brain, especially when it's happening over such a prolonged period of time?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I don't think we can really talk about trauma without talking about fear. And I believe that that's one of the things that continues to come up. So it's fear and anger. But if you think about 18 months ago, there was extraordinary uncertainty, a lot of fear, and a lot of conversations around what could or would or should happen. And I think that what we know for sure is that fear that doesn't quite turn off. We know what that's like to be uncertain, to sort of feel, in some ways like you're not able to think straight and to move in the ways in which you normally do. But think about this prolonged fear response, which is really meant to help us survive. Think about that on all the time, chronically trying to find answers, chronically trying to feel secure. And so what that's experienced as trauma can be considered a fear response that doesn't quite turn all the way off. And I think it's appropriate to think about that fear that doesn't quite turn off in the context of what we are seeing right now, where folks are chronically fearful of what may happen, fearful of what hasn't happened. And it has definitely put folks on edge appropriately, because it also helps us to remember, right? So we remember the things that caused us to feel less safe, and that helps us in many ways avoid that. And now we're in a situation where we do remember those things that made us feel less safe, and some folks are working to avoid that, and others maybe less so. And so it's an interesting position that we find ourselves in. And I think your question about where we go from here it is going to be an important one.
Well, we're at a point in the pandemic where blame feels easy. We know that the vaccine saves lives. Some people are still refusing to get it. DK tweets, there are people I know who won't even talk to me about the vaccine. They're hard right folks. Yes, I'm mad. I don't understand what their problem is. It has ruined friendships. Alexandra, how do we let ourselves feel anger without dehumanizing the people we're angry with?
I think it's a huge challenge. I mean, one piece is we need to remember that people who are refusing the vaccine are not a monolithic group. And the tweet that you just read is somebody who's saying, that their experience is that the vaccine refusers are hard right. And there is data certainly that bears out vaccine rates that vary, red states versus blue states. And it's not the only. So sometimes a vaccine choice is a reflection of a political belief or an ideology and a desire to kind of belong or fit in with a particular group. Other times, vaccine refusal is fueled by other kinds of more personal health beliefs, by, historical experiences and fears. And I think sometimes it is fueled by deeper sorts of senses of who's in charge of my body, who understands my pain, who's going to listen. And I tell you what, anger makes sense because unlike something, where your health choice, your choice to smoke a cigarette, doesn't really bear on me, what gets, the reason that anger gets so activated is that your choice to not vaccinate, at the larger scale affects, me and sort of the future direction of this pandemic. So that's, of course, why anger is, takes the front seat. And I think that when we're talking about, if we like tighten up the lens and we talk about how individuals can have conversations across, vaccine lines. I mean, we've had so many lines in these last 18 months, and now we are up against a vaccine line. The thing I know to be true is when we have to talk across a difficult line, we have to figure out how to move anger a bit into the passenger seat and put empathy and curiosity and patience into the driver's seat. And as my colleague was just saying, in part, that is about kind of working with our bodies. Anger is such an embodied feeling. So I can't talk across a difficult line like that if I'm angry and my whole body is dysregulated. So when it's time to have that conversation with somebody we love who's in a different place than we are about vaccine decisions, we have to be regulating our bodies first and foremost so we can speak from a place of curiosity, patience, and empathy rather than anger, which is just going to fuel more division.
I want to get into that a bit more in a moment, because I think what you just described is exactly what a lot of people are struggling with right now. And I think it ties back to the fear response you were talking about, Dr. Moreland Capuia, and that many people have been living in this heightened state of awareness, of fear, trying to protect themselves and their loved ones. And then they look around them and they see people in their family, in their community, people they care about, even strangers, who aren't operating with that same care and concern. And it brings up these feelings of anger, but I think there's something else there. It's like, why aren't you as worried as I am? Doctor, does that make sense?
It does, and I want to try to string together a few thoughts here, if you could bear with me.
Sure.
It's interesting because I'm just remembering what Aristotle said at one point, that anyone can get angry, right? That's the easy thing. However, to be angry at the right thing, in the right, with the proper extent, at the proper moment, with the right motive, that's not the so easy part. And so the question that I think beneath the question is, who are we really angry with, and what are we really angry at? And I think it gets to this question, this point. I want to use this metaphor. We just came off of the Olympics, and I watched the men's 4x400 and the women's 4x100 and 4x400, and they took home the gold. And it's very interesting to me that there are 4 different individuals who went as individuals to compete individually with different beliefs, different thoughts, but when it came time to cross one finish line for a goal, right, to get that gold medal, they were able to work in concert to pass the baton, to move around that track, to get to the finish line, to get the gold. And I think that that's really where we want to get to, is that how do we get different folks with different motives and different beliefs for a moment in time to come together to get across the finish line. There are multiple things that I think barriers that have gotten in the way. I think a part of it is that our inability to decouple this political speak from humanity. And just bear with me, because I think it is interesting when we use the narrative, we automatically sort of begin to separate things and people and put folks on opposite teams when we start to talk about red and blue, as opposed to humanity and what we must do in order to get across this finish line. And notice that I'm being very intentional in saying this finish line. There are going to be other finish lines, but this finish line of trying to get us across so that we heal collectively from COVID. We're asking people to work collectively. However, we're talking angrily towards each other. We're using fear communication and fear speech. And the very thing that's going to be required for all of us to collectively heal, which is interdependence, which is our reliance on one another, which is bonds. Anger undoubtedly breaks those social bonds, and it really begins to get in the way of our ability to move towards the end goal. So in my mind, the real question is, how do we remove fear? How do we try to use the anger in a productive way to help get us to goal? Because we know that anger can serve 2 purposes. One, it does help us to survive. It helps us to leads us through sort of negative outcomes. It helps us to, again, to overcome obstacles. But then we also know that anger disrupts very important interpersonal relationships and
Let's
bonds.
pause here for just a moment. We're talking about growing anger during the pandemic with Alexandra Solomon and Dr. Alicia Moreland-Capuia. I'm Jen White. This is 1A from WAMU and NPR.
The best public health campaigns are invisible by design. Dr. Lena Wen is an emergency physician, public health professor at George Washington University, and former Baltimore Health Commissioner. She joins us to discuss her work in the area of public health on everything from opioid addiction to disease outbreaks to infant mortality. That's next time on Think. Tonight at 10 on WJCT News 89.9.
The way manufacturers label foods can be a bit patchy.
They're just, essentially making it up or making an educated guess. And that's where most of these dates come from.
I'm Amy Scott. Expiration dates next time on Marketplace.
Tonight at 6 on WJCT News 89.9.
Nearly 3 years ago, former CIA Director Michael Hayden had a stroke, which affected his ability to communicate. Despite his struggles, he considers himself lucky.
Every once in a while, I'm sad, okay? But mainly, no, I want to do more.
Living with aphasia, this afternoon on All Things Considered from NPR News.
Starting at 4 on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from Aspiration, a digital banking alternative designed for people who care about the environment. Customers can plant a tree with every swipe of their debit card to offset their carbon footprint. Aspiration.com/green. And from C3 AI. C3 AI software enables organizations to use artificial intelligence at enterprise scale, solving previously unsolvable problems. C3 AI. This is Enterprise AI.
I'm Jen White. This is 1A. We're discussing the anger some are feeling towards those unwilling to get vaccinated with Alexandra Solomon. She's a clinical psychologist at the Family Institute at Northwestern University. Also with us is Dr. Alicia Moreland-Capuia. She's the executive director of Trauma-Informed Treatment, Consultation, and Outreach at the Center of Excellence in Depression and Anxiety Disorders. We're also hearing from you. Lindsay tweets, "I'm honestly just frustrated. This could be over or close to it, and it's getting worse. I feel like people are so quick to think of themselves before people they love, and it's disheartening." Dr. Moreland-Capuia, I just want to pick up briefly on what you were saying before the break about anger, and you use this metaphor of the 4x400 relay at the Olympics. And what I hear from people is this feeling that some of us are running the relay and some of us are running an individual race. It's like when it's time to hand off that baton to the next leg in the race, that person takes off without taking the baton, thinking it's an individual race. So how do we create the space for that conflict, that feeling of conflict, that it doesn't feel like we're all doing the same thing. It doesn't feel like we're all working toward the same goal.
Right. I think it's a very good question. And I think that we're in a situation where multiple things can be true. And I think that the motive for where I would like to sort of caution all of us is to not maybe jump to conclusions about why someone isn't doing a thing. I want to give a quick example to just answer that, and it will be quick. There was a conversation that I was recently mediating between family members about the situation, vaccination versus unvaccinated. And in the communication, there was lots of anger. And we know when we're angry, we're not necessarily using our best language. We're not necessarily doing our best thinking. We're just trying to kind of get it out. And in this conversation, there were multiple talking points between both parties. And I kindly just said, if I might, I asked permission to make an observation. And my observation was, I don't believe we're communicating what we really want to communicate. And so I offered some reframes, and one was, instead of sort of name calling, blaming, and pointing fingers, is it possible to say, I'm really afraid, and I love you, and I want you to have the best chance at surviving and living the best that you can. And if you believe that you're making that decision, then I'll respect it. And as we did these reframes and came back a week later, what was shared was that it was, for the first time, being able to move away from just anger, fear, pointing fear and yelling and miscommunicating. There was an option to move towards understanding and to make a different choice. And ultimately, the outcome was very positive. So I would say that, yes, there are some who have dropped the baton, some who have been running their individual races. The question again becomes, how do we redirect that and get folks to join in on the relay and get those passes, flawless. And I believe that that's possible. That we have to be having different conversations. That's the plea I'm making today.
Alexandra, being a therapist often means getting to the bottom of people's anger and fear so they can make better choices. How has your practice helped you understand what's happening in the country more broadly around anger and fear?
Yeah, well, the points that Dr. Moreland Capria is making are well served. I've been thinking a lot about, this little toy that sometimes children get at a birthday party, like these little finger cuffs, right, where you put your fingers in, but then the more you pull, the tighter they get. And so oftentimes, as a couples therapist, certainly this is the bulk of my work, is helping people rather than pull harder in their own direction, which is what happens when we are upset, helping people take a step towards and a step towards and a step towards. And sometimes it is what Dr. Moreland Capria is saying about like getting personal and making an I statement. I am scared for you. I love you. I feel confused by your choice. And sometimes it's asking a question. And as a therapist, one of our favorite kinds of questions is something called a constraint question. So rather than saying, why won't you just get the shot? Asking instead, what's keeping you from getting the shot? What's in the way? What are the blocks? If we start to name the blocks, the concerns, the stances, the beliefs, then we can start to look at the blocks together and maybe start to take them apart, move them to one side. But if we ask the question, why aren't you just doing it? All it does is invite somebody to dig in a bit further. And if that person who's refusing the vaccine has a history of feeling misunderstood, of feeling violated, of feeling, like their power's been taken away, they're going to fight that much harder. And so I think that you're right, Jen, to say that these conversations can be person by person, and at this point they likely need to be person by person. And that starting point of like, help me understand what's keeping you from getting this shot.
I want to read a couple of messages we got. Linda emails, I'm an 81-year-old female who has had both vaccines. My brother-in-law and his wife have refused to get the vaccine. I would really like to visit them, but if they continue to think that it's a hoax and not get vaccinated, I will not fly to Florida to visit. I cannot understand their thinking, but it is their right. It is also my right to refuse to visit them. I am not angry. I am simply keeping my distance. And Zarina writes, I'm at the point of despair with my mom. I can't compete with the sheer ocean of falsehoods she swims in, or my family, who are either complicit in feeding her lies or saying, let her decide for herself. I told her I can't stand by and watch if she gets sick and dies, but I fear it is inevitable. Dr. Moreland Capria, a number of health officials, and this is echoed in what Alexandra just said, they say the best way to get someone vaccinated who is hesitant is to keep having conversations with them. I think part of what gets missed in that advice is the cost of the person trying to have that conversation. Most of us are not therapists. We don't necessarily have the tools that you have to engage in those conversations in a way that is healthy for us. We have emotional responses. We have physiological responses. Sometimes it's damaging to our mental health. So how do you know when it's time to step back and take your hands off to really protect yourself?
I think it's a very good conversation and things to consider, right? There is a distinction in my mind between facilitation and leading. And when you go into a conversation trying to lead, I still feel like folks are working to convince as opposed to, the question is, am I communicating to understand, or am I communicating, or am I listening and communicating to respond? And most of the time, it is very interesting because there's always, you are going to get opposition when you're telling somebody in many ways that they're wrong, right? And the conversations often go to that. You're wrong about something, and nobody wants to be told that they're wrong, as opposed to, I can see that view, and I'd like to ask. My colleague has used the word here to be curious, right? To allow folks to explore. We know that learning is nonlinear, and we also know that change doesn't happen overnight. If there's a commitment and if there's a genuine love for someone, it does require in some ways a little bit of long suffering, not completely and absolutely to the point that it destroys your mental health. I believe that if it's reached that point, that there is a place in time where you step back and hope that what you have given is helpful, and maybe even ask for other folks to support you in that effort. But if it is I think that, we've got to be able to be in places and spaces where we know where we've reached our limit, where it's like, okay, I've been as effective as I think I can be, and then to leave it, to someone else or to something else. And that is hard to do as well. I think I'll stop there. But
I mean, part of what I hear you saying, and Alexandra, I'd love to hear you weigh in on this, is figuring out where perhaps those healthy boundaries are with family members, and how to establish those boundaries in a way that I don't know if it's possible to do that all the time without damaging the relationship, because it's like, okay, how do I signal that I am not in agreement, that I cannot agree with whatever it is, you're deciding or saying, or the misinformation you're believing. But I do love you, but I've got to put a boundary here for myself.
That's right. And that's what I heard in a couple of those tweets that you just read. And I think sometimes we'll do just about anything to avoid grieving and accepting, right? It's sort of like, but maybe if I said it this way, maybe if I stood on my head, maybe if I added some jazz hands, like I think that some of us are at risk of really, really, really trying, like, but maybe. And that can be a defense against the profound sadness and grief that come when we say, I have to let go and I have to make a choice that protects myself, maybe my physical self, right? The woman who's saying she's not going to travel to Florida to visit family. That's a profoundly sad situation, right? That's so sad. And so for her to then allow in that grief is another stage, right? So perhaps there's like this resistance against having to just accept and grieve how very, very sad it is that sometimes we do make a choice either for our mental health, which is I really tried to be compassionate. I tried to present information, and I'm meeting up with, kind of a brick wall here. And so I let go and I step away. It's very complicated, but you're right that one of the sort of like, the compass north is my own mental health, because if I am eroding my own mental health in an effort to save, convince, or shift somebody else, I'm of no service to anybody.
We're talking to Alexandra Solomon. She's a clinical psychologist at the Family Institute at Northwestern University. Also with us is Dr. Alicia Moreland-Capuia. She's the Executive Director of Trauma-Informed Treatment, Consultation, and Outreach at the Center of Excellence in Depression and Anxiety Disorders. We also want to hear from you. How are you feeling about where we are right now? If you're angry or frustrated with the situation, what's at the root of that? If differences over the vaccine and health guidance have put a strain on your relationships, we'd love to hear from you too. You can comment on our Facebook page, tweet us at 1A, or send us an email at 1a@wamu.org. Jennifer tweets this: I can be empathetic towards someone who has genuine medical concerns about the vaccine, but I feel nothing but anger toward those who are anti-vaccine due to political misinformation. And Ryan also emails, I think it's very important to reevaluate our framing around this issue. Many of the unvaccinated did not come to their conclusion completely naturally. There's a significant movement among right-wing media and politicians that's been pushing anti-vaccination rhetoric. We should be angry at the people who lied to them, not not the individuals. They're victims in their own way. And Dr. Moreland-Capuia, I want to sort of tackle this from a couple of different perspectives. The first being that there has been a lot of misinformation, and as you said, the people who aren't vaccinated, they're not a monolith. So how, when you're trying to talk to someone who is very steeped in that misinformation, how do you recommend perhaps navigating that type of conversation?
No, I've had multiple conversations that have actually ended positively, and a lot of them started with very open-ended questions, as Alexandra has, I think, modeled several times here and echoed. It is me asking the question, what is the barrier? Where is the fear? And then trying to understand that and to do the best I can to meet whatever need. At that particular instance, I literally, just as we are talking, had a family member who I have been talking to for the last month is going today to get a Moderna vaccination. And this is after a month of, so I know that it is frustrating, and I think everyone has a right to be frustrated. Anger is a very real feeling. And I don't want us to lose sight of the fact that things do change and people do change over time. And it may not be soon enough, right, in some folks' mind, but you know, it is happening. The changes are happening. I wish I could literally just show you the text message. It says, I'm going today to get this shot. So in the conversations that I've had with this person who, it seemed like a change averse individual, was very much open-ended. What do you need from me? How can I support you in thinking about, might you be willing to consider this? As opposed to, again, telling folks that they're wrong. When you get into the finger pointing and the blaming and all we are communicating is anger, it's difficult to get to reasoning and to get folks to consider making a different choice. And I agree with the caller who essentially said that the narrative has shifted, and there's a lot of false narratives out there, and there's a lot of false information that folks are consuming. I think that there also is a role that leadership in every area must play to actively counter that false narrative. I think that has to be a strategy moving forward as well.
Well, we've talked about people who might be afraid to get the vaccine, but Alexandra, what about the very real fear of losing a loved one who refuses to get vaccinated? We got this message from Pachi, who says, I'm not shocked we're where we are, but I'm disappointed. I have family that's fully aware of how lethal the virus can be. We're from New York City, and we know people who have passed away, but they continue to not get vaccinated for many reasons. At this point, I'm just waiting to hear some sad news. Is there any way to navigate that fear?
I think the way that we navigate the fear is in some ways by just grounding ourselves in what we actually can control, right? Really being humble in the face of the limits of our control. And this is something we worked on a lot during the pandemic, where so much has felt out of control. So I do think there are some daily practices, that help us feel like we have our feet on the ground and a bit of agency over at least our little world around us. And I think those practices, it seems, it may seem silly, but being really mindful as we prepare our food, being really mindful as we exercise, like all of these things that kind of remind us that there are things that we have control over. And we also have control over where we let our thoughts go. So if this person is sort of noticing that their mind is spinning out about what if and what if and what if, that noticing, aha, there I go again. My mind is spinning. What can I do right here, right now, to return to the present moment? And the present moment is this loved one is alive, that loved one is alive. And so I'm going to drink some water. I'm going to get some fresh air. I'm going to turn on some music. So those very, very micro practices for our mental health are immensely important right now.
We're discussing the growing anger towards those unwilling to get vaccinated and what to do with that anger with clinical psychologist Alexandra Solomon and psychiatrist Dr. Alicia Moreland-Capuia. How are you feeling right now? If you're feeling a great deal of anger or you're having trouble navigating conversations with people in your life, let us know. You can send us an email at 1a@wamu.org, leave a message on our Facebook page, or tweet us at 1a. We'll be back with more in a moment. I'm Jen White.
a priest in northern Iraq, says his town was always a home for Christians.
Since the 3rd or 4th century after Christ, and continued like that till 1980.
That's when Saddam Hussein started changing the demographics. Then, more recently, came ISIS. Today, Iraqi Christians are hanging on to their homeland. It's on the world.
This afternoon at 3, here on WJCT News 89.9.
I'm Scott Tong. Former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers was among the first economists to raise a red flag about the risks of inflation as the economy heats up and comes out of the pandemic recession. We'll get his economic outlook. That's next time on Here and Now.
Today at 2 on WJCT News 89.9. On the next Fresh Air, Kenan Thompson, nominated for an Emmy for his performances on Saturday Night Live. He's been with the show longer than any cast member in SNL history. He also has an Emmy nomination for his leading role in the NBC sitcom Kenan. He plays a TV talk show host grieving the death of his wife and raising 2 children. Join us.
Today at noon on WJCT News 89.9.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from your part-time controller, specializing in nonprofit accounting. Your part-time controller helps nonprofit organizations with their accounting needs, remotely or in person. More at yourparttimecontroller.com. And from Angie. Angie's List is now Angie, committed to helping homeowners find the right pros for home improvement projects. Homeowners can read reviews, see upfront pricing for hundreds of projects, and book appointments at Angie.com.
This is 1A. Back to our conversation in a moment, but first, we'd love your help with one of tomorrow's shows. We'll be talking with Rodrigo Garcia, the son of the late Colombian novelist Gabriel Garcia Marquez. His new memoir follows the final days of his father's life and how he forged his own path as a filmmaker in the U.S. We'd love to hear from you if you're a fan of Gabriel Garcia Marquez. What resonates with you about his work? Leave us a voicemail, 855-236-1A1A. Maybe you know what it's like to carve out your own identity separate from your parents' legacy. How did you do it? And what key lessons from your parents did you bring with you? Tell us your story, 855-236-1A1A. Or you can send us an audio file with our app, 1A Vox Pop, and we'll share some of your stories tomorrow on 1A. Now let's get back to our conversation about the growing anger towards those unwilling to get vaccinated and what to do with that anger with clinical psychologist Alexandra Solomon and psychiatrist Dr. Alicia Moreland-Capuia. Here are a couple of other messages we've got. Connie says, I'm so very frustrated. My daughter kept my grandkids home last year and was planning to send them back to brick and mortar school this year. They are 7, 5, and 3 years old. 85% of the people in our area refuse to mask up and continue to say kids can't get COVID. Many of them are anti-vaxxers. She is so afraid for her kids. I am too. And Jennifer writes, if people's fear of the vaccine were based on science, I would have more sympathy. However, it's usually based on proven falsehoods, or people equate not getting the vaccine or not wearing a mask as an oppressive government at the potential cost of their own health and those around them, including children too young to get the vaccine. These reasons do make me angry. I want to focus in on the child piece of this because right now vaccines are not available for kids under 12. And Dr. Moreland-Capuia, I mean, kids are watching all of this, experiencing this all with us. Their lives have been upended as well. What kinds of conversations would you encourage parents to have with their kids, especially if their kids are experiencing anger and frustration?
Also, another very good question. I've got children of my own and have had to have these conversations. And a part of it is helping our children to realize that people are complicated and situations are complicated and complex, and things don't always make sense. But it goes back again to this conversation of what can we do within the spaces that we're in, with the circle of influence that we have. What can we do to create safety for our children in the homes that they're in and the relationships that they have. But it is a very difficult situation because we are asking Americans to sort of act collectively. And historically, it has been about sort of rugged individualism, and that's how you make it as a person, as a family. And now we're saying we really need to work together. And I honestly, part of the conversation that we've had too is about how to talk to folks, even when you disagree with them. You know, you can disagree without being disagreeable. I think that there's a way to still communicate your need, because what we are left with when we communicate angrily towards one another is compromise. And really, compromise is just another way to think about unmet need. That means both you and me leave the conversation with both of our needs unmet. And if the real goal is to ensure that we all move towards something that feels safer for all of us, right? Because if I feel safe and you don't feel safe, then we should probably reevaluate, right, where we are. And so I think that there's still very much opportunity. I don't want us to lose sight or hope that that there are situations and circumstances of which conversations can move people to something different. And I want my children and all children to know that we don't all have to agree, but we still can have meaningful conversations and help folks think about something differently.
Here's an email we got from one of you. You say, I am most angry at immediate family member who refuses to vaccinate themselves and their eligible kids, travels the country, owns a fitness business where they are in contact with many, and guilts my aging parents into having sleepovers with their kids. It blows my mind that they could so selfishly put my aging parents and others at risk. I feel helpless to stop them and unsure how I'll let go of this anger when the pandemic ends. It has revealed a part of them that I feel is so reprehensible. Alexandra, what would you say to that person who's very concerned about letting go of the anger if we're on the other side of this?
Well, that's right. There's sort of the immediate crisis of, fear, and are they going to visit, and are they, spreading infection? And then there's, I hear this kind of like anticipatory loss, like I don't know how we're going to recover. And I think there is going to be lots of forgiveness work, down the road. It's really hard to do forgiveness work when we're like in the trenches, in the crisis. And I think that's the way that forgiveness work will look is going to vary family by family. And I suspect there will be some families where there'll be reconciliation, accountability, acknowledgement, and sort of piecing back together trust. Trust builds slowly, inch by inch. And I suspect there are some relationships that will be severed forever. And that is tragic and unfortunate, and kind of the nature of life. And if I can just chain onto what Dr. Moreland-Capuia was saying about parents, the other point that I would just really want to highlight is parents set the tone in their home, that's been an exhausting factor for 18 months, that parents have been setting the tone in their homes. But as we anticipate going back to school, and for some of our kids, for our teen, she's stepping into a building that she hasn't been in for 18 months. I know that my own work around my own efforts to stay calm, accepting, to find some spaces of equanimity will invite her to step forward with as much calm as she can muster, because this back to school is going to be unlike any back to school we've ever had. And so I just want to kind of implore parents to do their own work around finding pockets of calm and peace so that they can invite their kids to do the same.
Here are some more messages we got. Little More Time tweets, I'm extremely frustrated with some places not reinstating mask mandates just because people have pandemic fatigue. They're leaving everyone's health up to the unvaccinated, who seem the least likely in many cases to wear masks or take other mitigating action. And Loafing Cactus writes, anger at the unvaccinated, though natural, is being used as a deflection by political leaders against being held accountable for their mismanagement of the pandemic. These leaders have a much bigger impact on what we are experiencing than any particular anti-vaxxer. Dr. Moreland-Capuia, there is a very real frustration with people in charge. Some politicians and officials have shrugged off the seriousness of the pandemic. Some have contributed to the glut of misinformation. How do you confront anger that isn't directed at a person or even a group of people, but at a system that you feel is failing you?
Yeah, I think that it is a very real reality that we have some leaders in places who are misleading and not using the best of data to make decisions. And it does appear that if you are a public servant, my just sort of general statement is that you are there to serve the public and to keep the public safe, and your greatest resource is humans, and that if we want to keep humans safe and for them to persist, that we should think about the things that move them away from harm and move them closer to safety. So I do think there is a responsibility of someone who is in a public office to be responsible with the platform that they have, and things like masking. Right. The question that I often ask is, what harm would it do to put on a mask? What would be what's the harm? And oftentimes there's not a whole lot of, there are few responses, but very minimal responses to ask someone to do that, to ask folks to do what they can from where they can, right? So it's to do what you can where you are, and to the best of your ability. I think that the more consistently we're able to ask folks to do that, again, outside of anger, outside of judgment, outside of putting folks in boxes and labels, but just saying, we honestly need you to do this for the communities that we're in. And I would take it from community to community, from municipality to municipality, from state to state, asking folks to do what they can where they are. But there is a responsibility as a leader, that you have to help others be responsible and to use narrative and language and to follow rules and to think very thoughtfully about what it means to keep a whole community safe.
We're talking to Dr. Alicia Moreland Capuia. She's the Executive Director of Trauma-Informed Treatment, Consultation, and Outreach at the Center of Excellence in Depression and Anxiety Disorders. Also with us, Alexandra Solomon. She's a clinical psychologist at the Family Institute at Northwestern University. But Alexandra, I think a lot of what we hear, especially from folks I talk to, is this feeling of helplessness, whether the anger is directed at a political system or at an individual or at a group of people. At the core of a lot of it is a feeling of just not being able to do enough or do enough to protect the people you love. What do you do with that?
I often think of coping, which is what we're talking about here. Coping has two faces, two aspects. And one aspect of coping is stepping up and using our voice and using our power. And that's the form that activism takes. And the other face of coping, which is just as important, it's not a better or worse. The other face of coping is self-care and stepping away and resting. And I remember in 2016 when we were sort of the Women's March was taking effect, I remember reading somewhere this image of a choir. And when a choir needs to hold a very, very long note, different singers will take their breath at different moments. And that's such a beautiful image that I've held onto about those two faces of coping. And so part of it is using our power and making sure that we don't succumb to helplessness as individuals and also as citizens and as voters. So I think that's, remembering our power there. But the other way that we stay well and healthy and kind of in it for the long run is by stepping away and caring for ourselves and letting ourselves distract, turning off the news, stepping away from our phones, engaging with nature, distracting ourselves with some really escapey television or escapey novels. So we get to also do that. We must do that.
I want to read this email from Doug. He says, I don't understand why vaccines had to turn political. I'm 40 and vaccinated. Recently, a high school classmate and her husband were diagnosed and hospitalized with COVID. He passed after a couple of days. She is still on a ventilator. They were what I term super Trumpers, and I feel bad that I really don't care. They made their choice. I hate that I feel this way. And this, Alexandra, it sounds like Doug is struggling with finding some empathy for these people he knew, and he doesn't like it. He doesn't like that he doesn't feel anything about it. Any guidance for Doug?
Well, I first of all just love that he's able to name it, because sometimes we do this really funky two-step with our emotions. We'll have an emotion and then we will layer on top of it a story of that's not an emotion that a good person has. That's not an appropriate emotion for this situation. So there's Doug sitting in the complicated truth of his feelings. And it's something about the idea of informed consent and people sort of making choices and living with consequences. But I think that is what Doug is tapping into is some uncomfortable truth that we all sit with, which is that we are made up of all kinds of complicated feelings and reactions. And we certainly do a lot better mental health wise when we can just kind of honor the complexity rather than trying to line up our emotions on some axis like these are the appropriate ones and these are the inappropriate ones. That doesn't really serve our mental health very well.
Dr. Morlin Capuia, when we're angry, not necessarily just about the pandemic, but about anything, there's this impulse, I think, we have to tell one another to find a way to make that anger productive or to find a way to fix the anger. But is it okay to just be angry?
Absolutely. I think you get to feel the full range of your emotions and you get to be where you are. And the only question that I would ask is, after you have been sitting in the anger for a while, does it get you to goal? Does it serve you well individually, psychologically and physically? And I would say that anger is very real, and it is valid. It is a very real emotion, and it has a role. The question is, should it have a lifetime role? Should it take up residence in your body and your psyche 24/7? And I think that those are questions that individuals have to answer. At the end of the day, it is about you preserving yourself so that you can continue to do the good that you want to do as an individual. And the questions that I would just encourage folks to ask is, does the anger serve that purpose?
I want to end with this tweet we got from Marion, who says, I'm heartbroken. Saturday night, my sweet mom-in-law died from COVID. She was excited for the vaccine in February, but then a family member convinced her it was an evil plot, and down the misinformation rabbit hole she went. Our 3 teenagers are so angry, I don't know if they'll ever forgive this. Marion, I'm so sorry for your loss. But Alexandra, the real life risks that we're facing right now. This isn't something that's just an academic exercise. It is life and death. And for Marion, her family is facing not just anger, but they're going to have to deal with the grief of losing a loved one. For people who have lost people during this pandemic, and there may be some complications around that loss, what would you suggest for them? What are some of the earliest conversations they need to have as a family?
I'm so sorry for that loss. It's absolutely heartbreaking. And, the thing that we know about grief is it lives in our bodies and it takes all kinds of forms. And it's absolutely tragic that she was on one path and she got moved away from that path. And I can only imagine the amount of anger that they feel towards that influential relative. And sometimes we forgive, not because anybody else, quote unquote, deserves it, but we forgive in order to save ourselves, in order to save our sanity. And so that may be some of their work is forgiving in order to save themselves so that they can just feel the grief and the sadness and the loss.
Well, if you or someone you know is struggling with mental health issues, you can always call the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services hotline at 1-800-662-4356. That's 1-800-662-4356. We were joined today by Alexandra Solomon. She's a clinical psychologist at the Family Institute at Northwestern University, and Dr. Alicia Morlin Capuia. She's the Executive Director of Trauma-Informed Treatment, Consultation, and Outreach at the Center of Excellence in Depression and Anxiety Disorders. Thanks to you both. And thank you for all your questions and comments. We're glad you joined the conversation. Today's producer was Haley Blassingame. This program comes to you from WAMU, part of American University in Washington, distributed by NPR. I'm Jen White. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again tomorrow. This is 1A.
Support for NPR comes from this station and from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, a private corporation funded by the American people. From Caring Transitions, a senior move resource to help families ease the stress of life's transitions, offering relocation, home cleanouts, and the resale of everyday household items. Locations at caringtransitions.com. And from the Public Welfare Foundation, committed to advancing transformative youth and criminal justice reforms.
Film director Rodrigo Garcia is the son of the late Colombian novelist Gabriel Garcia Marquez. His father's fame and the time spent with him in his final days lies at the heart of Garcia's new memoir.
Accepting that my father also belonged to other people, sometimes it was a pain in the ass.
I'm Jen White. Rodrigo Garcia joins me next time on 1A.
I think that the technology that I'm most excited about right now, both for my industry and for
Florida Department of Environmental Protection believes that Florida's coral reef is purely and uniquely Florida and needs to be protected. Abundant with marine life, Florida's coral reef provides vital economic support for coastal communities. More at floridascoralreef.org. Nova Southeastern University. The world's precious coral reefs provide habitat, food, and shelter to a vast array of aquatic organisms. NSU researchers are dedicated to protecting and restoring these delicate ecosystems. Learn more at hcas.nova.edu.
The Times Union Local IQ says, ready to grow your business? With the Learning Hub, you'll learn how local marketing can help your business reach the right audience. No tests or software required. localiq.com/lab for more info.
This is WJCT News 89.9 Jacksonville. Ahead in the next 5 minutes, live local news for the First Coast from the WJCT News team.
From WHYY in Philadelphia, I'm Terry Gross with Fresh Air. Today, Kenan Thompson. He's nominated for 2 Emmys, for his performances on Saturday Night Live and for his starring role in the NBC sitcom Kenan. He won an Emmy for co-writing the SNL satirical song Come Back Barack. He's been a cast member of SNL longer than anyone in the show's history. We'll talk about some of his sketches, including Black Jeopardy, and about being a child actor. At about the same time he auditioned for SNL, he was playing Fat Albert in the TV series inspired by Bill Cosby characters. Years later on SNL, after Cosby's conviction, Thompson played Cosby in his prison cell. We'll talk about that too. Later, Maureen Corrigan will review a new book she describes as a moving and deadpan funny novel about religious life, faith, and doubt. First News.
Live from NPR News, I'm Lakshmi Singh. The first woman to lead the state of New York is preparing to take office, a day after Governor Andrew Cuomo resigned in the wake of sexual harassment allegations. In less than 2 weeks, Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul takes over. NPR's Brian Mann has more on what Hochul is likely to face when she becomes governor.
Hochul, who's from Buffalo, New York, isn't a high-profile public figure, but said in a statement she is ready to lead. She'll take over at a moment when New York is seeing a surge of COVID-19 cases because of the Delta variant. The economy is still reeling from the pandemic, and many of the state's cities have seen sharp increases in violent crime. There are also deep divisions between moderate Democrats like Hochul and progressives who've been gaining power. Cuomo's departure also triggers a competitive race for governor. With the election next year, all eyes are on State Attorney General Letitia James. Her office produced the report of alleged sexual harassment that brought Cuomo down. She'll be a frontrunner if she enters the governor's race. Brian Mann, NPR News, New York.
Numerous lives are being upended by scores of fires still burning across the western U.S. today. The largest among them, the Dixie Fire in Northern California. It has surpassed 500,000 acres. It has destroyed more than 1,000 homes, businesses, and other structures. And though it is roughly 25% contained, hotter and drier conditions this week could change that. As scientists worldwide note, climate change intensifying the extreme heat fueling fires here and in other parts of the globe. Reporter Joanna Kakissis is covering wildfires burning in Greece amid a prolonged heat wave there.
Firefighters are trying to put out a rekindled blaze in southern Greece near ancient Olympia, site of the first Olympic Games. At least 20 villages have been evacuated. Fires continue to rage on Greece's second largest island, Evia. There's widespread consensus among climate scientists that climate change makes large, destructive wildfires more likely because of hotter temperatures and drier vegetation.
Joanna Kakissis reporting. The United States is calling on the president of Syria to help free an American journalist last seen in Syria 9 years ago this week. NPR's Michelle Kellerman reports on the latest statement about Austin Tice.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken says he believes it is within Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's power to free Austin Tice. The journalist and Marine veteran turns 40 years old today. Tice was abducted at a Syrian checkpoint in 2012, and U.S. officials had indications that he was held by an armed group allied with Assad. Blinken's statement makes no mention of any new intelligence on Tice's whereabouts. The statement says the U.S. envoy for hostage affairs, Roger Carstens, and his team are, quote, working diligently and around the clock to bring Austin back to his family. Michelle Kellerman, NPR News.
The Dow Jones Industrial Average is up nearly 170 points. This is NPR.
4 minutes after noon now. Our temperature's up to almost to 90 degrees here in downtown Jacksonville. You're listening to WJCT News 89.9. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis stopped in Jacksonville yesterday to hand out checks to police officers at the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. It was part of the Florida Heroes Initiative, giving $1,000 to first responders. And as the state holds its place as the epicenter of the country's latest coronavirus surge, WJCT News' Raymond Troncoso reports the governor continues to emphasize treatment over prevention.
DeSantis is doubling down on his opposition to mask mandates, threatening the salaries of school district leaders who impose them. DeSantis in Jacksonville also went after the federal government, accusing the CDC of misreporting the number of COVID cases in Florida and questioning a recent media report that 300 ventilators are being delivered to the state.
I have to check to see whether that's true or not. I would honestly doubt that that's true, but I'll look because we have a lot of stuff that we stockpiled over the last year and a half through the Department of Emergency Management. I've not had any requests across my desk. I've not been notified of that.
DeSantis also continues to tout monoclonal antibody treatments, which can help COVID patients when taken early enough, though health officials are stressing the importance of vaccines as the single most important tool in stopping the spread of the virus. Raymond Troncoso, WJCT News 89.9.
It's partly cloudy and 88 degrees in Jacksonville.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Charles Schwab, with a variety of financial planning options from online tools to meeting with a financial consultant. Schwab works to make it easy to plan for tomorrow today. More at schwab.com/plan.
Today in music history from Anthology, August 11th, 1973, the first big oldies revival kicks off in earnest as George Lucas's new film American Graffiti opens in theaters across America. Set in 1962, the film creates a wave of nostalgia for songs from the 50s and early 60s. Hear all the great songs on Anthology on 89.9 HD3.
It seems so good to see you back again. How long has it been?
This is Fresh Air. I'm Terry Gross. My guest, Kenan Thompson, is nominated for 2 Emmys for his comedy performances on Saturday Night Live and for his starring role in his new NBC sitcom, Kenan. On Kenan, he plays the host of a local morning TV show in Atlanta. The show is all about advice, recipes, and cheerful talk, but he's still grieving the loss of his wife and is now a single father, raising his 2 young daughters, and finding it hard to devote enough time to his family while also hosting the show. It's been renewed for a 2nd season, and you can watch the 1st season free, streaming on NBC Peacock. Kenan Thompson won an Emmy in 2017 for co-writing the SNL song parody Come Back Barack. Thompson has been with SNL for 18 years, making him the performer with the longest tenure in the history of the show. Among the recurring sketches he's best known for are the game shows Black Jeopardy and What's Up With That. Some of the characters he's played over the years include Steve Harvey, Al Sharpton, O.J. Simpson, Charles Barkley, and Bill Cosby. Thompson played Fat Albert, one of the characters Cosby created, in the live-action adaptation of the Fat Albert animated series. Cosby voiced the character himself in the animated series. Thompson has had a TV career since he was a child. Kenan Thompson, welcome to Fresh Air. It is great to have you on our show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So I want to start with a clip from an episode of Black Jeopardy because that's always so funny. And this is a very special episode of Black Jeopardy that I want to play because it features Chadwick Boseman as the guest contestant.
Mm-hmm.
And For any listeners not familiar with this recurring sketch, could you just explain the premise of Black Jeopardy?
I mean, it's basically in the title, you know. It's the black version, like if Jeopardy was hosted and produced by a mostly black, you know, situation, basically. And it's just to lean into that, you know, different jokes and stuff like that. And what those joke premises are about, basically, would be in the black section of things instead of just the Jeopardy section. So there you have it.
Okay, so here's an episode of Black Jeopardy with, of course, Kenan Thompson hosting, and the contestants are Chris Redd, Leslie Jones, and Chadwick Boseman, but in the role that he plays in Black Panther, T'Challa.
All right, Rashad, it's your pick. All right, let's go with all hell nah for 400. All right, the answer, the airline says they want to charge $25 to check your bag. Shanice.
What is all hell no? Looks like I'm gonna fly to Jamaica with a 50-pound suitcase in my lap.
Yeah, you're damn right. You're damn right. That's right. And I dare the stewardess to say something. That's right. Let's keep going.
Let's stay with grown ass for 600.
All right. You send your smart ass child here because she thinks she grown. T'Challa.
What is to one of our free universities where she can apply her intelligence and perhaps one day become a great scientist?
Okay, well, the answer we was looking for was out my damn house. But you know what? I'm gonna give it to you, T'Challa. Y'all must not have no mean streets in Wakanda. All right, the board is yours.
Very well. Let's go to hell nah for 800.
Okay. The policeman says there's been some robberies in your neighborhood and asks if you have any information.
What is? Not only do I tell this man what I know, but I also assist him in tracking down the offender. After all, our ministers of law enforcement are only here to protect us. Is this correct?
I mean, it should be. But I'm thinking you haven't spent much time in America. Let's just hear about today's prizes. Johnny?
So that was an episode of Black Jeopardy, hosted by my guest, Kenan Thompson. That is so much fun. Yeah, and then, of course, listening back to Chadwick Boseman. That must bring back memories for you.
Absolutely. I mean, that was such an electric week in general, you know, like the King, Chadwick, was just blessing us with his grace, number one, because Black Panther was the biggest thing going at the time, and you know, he contributed and gave all of his efforts and energy to our show like he did anything else while he was promoting, you know, a movie of that caliber. It was just unbelievable to witness, let alone being able to do like one